During the wartime blackouts of 1942 London, a killer exploited the darkness meant to protect the city from bombing. Women were attacked in their own homes and on dimly lit streets, often with terrifying speed and brutality. The press named him the Blackout Ripper, a figure who seemed to vanish as easily as he appeared, hidden by air raid sirens, shadows, and fear. Listen to the full story over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, link down below. I grew up in this little town called North Hatley up in Canada, a beautiful little place nestled on the northern shores of Lake Massawippi. And it's got some really grand houses, the kind of places doctors and lawyers from Montreal like to spend their summers. And for the first 7 years of my life, it was a privilege to live in such a peaceful, picturesque place. And then, the day after my 7th birthday, a lady I'd never seen before in my life tried to murder me. So this was in the summer of 1957. All the boats were out on the lake, and me and my friends were playing out in my family's front yard. None of the smaller lakeside houses had backyards, and instead had docks and jetties which stretched out into the water. But then whoever built them figured that they ought to have front lawns too, so front lawns they got. It had been a real scorcher of a day, so me and my buddies had been alternating between jumping off the dock at the back of our house and running around the front yard in our swimming trunks. The lake path was just feet away, but folks always drove down it nice and slow, and being in such a small town, the people driving past would sometimes wave to us because everyone knew everyone in those days. Now anyways, we're playing in the front yard, running around playing tag or whatever it was, when we spot a car coming down the road towards us. Now naturally, we're curious as to who it is, so we start lollygagging not far from the edge of the road to watch it approach. Sometimes we'd recognize people by their cars and sometimes not, especially in the summertime when all the tourists were in town. And the same was true for this car, a pale green Dodge Regent that didn't ring any bells for us. We watched it sort of trundling towards us, expecting it to keep the same low speeds, but as it got closer, it started to speed up. As the Regent's engine started to roar, I started to back up, and I guess it was out of pure instinct, in which case it was pure instinct which saved my life. Because backing up gave me, all three of us really, the head start that we needed to get the heck out of the way when that Regent veered onto the grass and came barreling towards us. We screamed as we ran for cover, hearing that thing coming up behind us at what must have been 60 to 70 miles per hour. If the driver hadn't been blind drunk, she might have had the motor skills to turn that wheel enough to hit us. But she was, so after careening right past us, she smashed into the tree in the front yard of old Mr. Finster next door. Now we assumed it had to have been an accident, and a terrible one at that, because the poor lady really did smash into that tree. She obliterated that poor Regent and gave herself some pretty serious injuries by the looks of things too, because when she got out of that car, she had blood all down her face and blouse. She looked young, younger than my mom, but older than my eldest sister, and I remember she was pretty too. And I also remember one of my buddies shouting, "Lady, lady, are you okay?" You know, the kind of dumb rhetorical question people ask when someone is clearly not okay. And I guess I didn't know what to expect from her at the time. I didn't know whether she'd give us a thumbs up and an A-okay or drop down dead right there. But what I definitely wasn't expecting was this bloodied, battered young woman to lock eyes with me and for her eyes to have this look of pure hatred in them. That was probably the most scared I've ever been in my life at that point, like something from a nightmare, but it was nothing to what came next. We only locked eyes for a matter of a second, but it felt like much longer, and that elastic moment only ended once the lady started stumbling around to the Regent's passenger seat. Suddenly, I heard a lady behind me yell, "Oh my God!" I turned to look, and saw one of our neighbors in the big houses on the other side of the road had come out of her house and was looking on in horror at what I believed was the stumbling lady in her wrecked car. That's not what scared her so much she yelled out, because when I turned back to the wrecked car, I saw the injured lady dragging a gun from the passenger seat. I didn't know it at the time because I thought all guns were rifles and couldn't conceive of the fact that that lady only had 2 shells in what was a long double-barrel shotgun. So when she pulled it from her car and shakily aimed it towards me, I just thought, I'm dead. It didn't matter that her first shot missed because as me and my buddies ran screaming towards our house, I thought that lady'd keep on shooting till she got us. But of course, she only had 1 more shot, so she lowered the shotgun and came scrambling across the grass towards us. Nobody was home at my place. My mom and older sister had gone for a walk and they'd told us, but we hadn't heard. And that's something I'm very thankful for in retrospect because I hate to think what would have happened if my mom or sister opened the door and gave the crazy lady a shot on all 4 or 5 of us. And since we saw her getting closer to us, we ran from the front door and towards the dock to get away from her. It was pretty much the only option available to us at the time, so we ran and we kept on running, expecting another shot to come at any moment. But it didn't. Not until we dived into the water, by which point it was this semi-muted blam coming from behind us above the water surface. Now, I was sure that I'd been shot. I just couldn't feel it for some reason. But as I stopped for a moment near the sandy bottom and checked my legs and back, there weren't any wounds, and although I was still too scared to surface for quite some time, it was only when I ran out of breath that I returned to the surface, and after taking a huge lungful of air, I saw one of our neighbors successfully wresting the shotgun from that lady's hands. He tossed it in the water, and then went about taking the lady down to the wooden deck before he asked if anyone was hurt. Thankfully, we were all fine, but the lady was screaming up an absolute storm. She was already hurt from the crash, and whatever happened to her was made a lot worse by our neighbor throwing her down onto the wooden decking. He then started yelling at us to go get someone, but we weren't even out of the water before someone else showed up carrying a rifle, unaware that the lady had already been disarmed and taken down. Our neighbor yelled at him to go call the cops, and then the man with the rifle went back the way that he came. Our neighbor, still pinning the lady to the deck, told us to get the hell back to the house and out of sight, and we were all so frightened of the hysterical way that she was behaving that we did just that. We walked around the house so all we could hear were her screams, and then watched and waited until the police showed up to drag the lady away. When my mom got back, she was hysterical too. I mean, you can see it from her perspective. No sooner does she head out for a walk with my sister, but some crazy lady shows up to try and run me and my friends down and shoot us. She felt terrible for not having been there to protect us when, really, we were all damn lucky that she and my sisters weren't there, because that crazy lady hadn't chosen to go after me and my friends just for the heck of it. In fact, she wasn't targeting my friends at all. She was after me, and incidentally my older sisters, and it's a miracle no one but her was hurt. When the cops got her back to the station and she slept off her booze, the lady sang like a canary and answered every question the cops had. She told them how she and my dad had been having an affair, and that he'd promised to run away with her and leave his wife and kids, us, behind. But then one day, he changed his mind and decided he was better off where he was. This infuriated the lady that he was cheating with, so much so that she threatened to murder his family. But my dad's response, "Psh, no you will not." She told him that she was deadly serious, no pun intended here, but he still didn't think that she'd actually go through with it. But this made her even angrier, and less than a week later, she got drunk on her father's alcohol, took a shotgun, and then rode his car across town to do the deed before she lost the stomach for it. And that's what I mean when I talk about how lucky we were, because if she wasn't drunk and she hadn't crushed her car and smashed her head against the steering wheel, I might very well not be around to write this. At first, the police officers only told my father the reasons why that lady tried to kill us, and he didn't see fit to tell my mother the full story. But as you can imagine, it was only a matter of time before she found out what really happened that day, and it caused the largest fight my parents have ever had, and coincidentally, it was the final one they ever had too. as a short while later, Mom took us south of the border to the United States, and the four of us, me, Mom, and my two sisters, lived in New York City for a number of years before Mom remarried and went to live on Long Island with our stepdad. We only got the full story of what happened next some years later, how the crazy lady went to jail, how my dad ended up drinking himself to death when it finally hit him that he'd almost got us all killed. I know it wasn't exactly his fault that the lady went nuts and was out for blood, but I imagine the whole thing would have been avoided if he'd just, I don't know, kept it in his pants. And sometimes I think about my dad and what it must have been like in the final days of his life. I wonder if the memories of his greed and pride were torturing him, or if he'd found just the right cocktail of booze to numb the pain enough to slip away without a single cogent moment of regret. I try not to feel too bad for him though, because I know there's an alternate timeline where he's drinking himself to death and feeling oh so sorry for himself next to 4 freshly filled graves, mine, my mom's, and my 2 sisters. Hey Joel, my name's Kieran and I'm from Glasgow. And when he was still with us, my old granddad, God rest his soul, told me a story that I think you'll enjoy reading. He moved to Glasgow back in the 40s when he was still a teenager, so his dad could work in the munitions factory since the war was on. But he grew up in this little coastal village called Strone. The name comes from the Scottish Gaelic for nose, and if you look at Strone on a map, the peninsula that Strone is situated on really does look like a big old schnauzer. But don't let the name fool you, because I visited Strone with my granddad and it really is beautiful. But it's also a place with a very dark secret, albeit a very open secret these days, and one my granddad let me in on one day after a few too many drums of whiskey. And so back in the 1900s, before World War I, Strone was exactly what it is now, just smaller. It's this charming wee village with nary a care in the world, full of smiley, happy people who all said hello when they passed each other on the shore road. There's a beautiful golf course that the town sort of sandwiches, so Strone would get all kinds of bigwigs and wealthy types coming through and making the cafe and pub owners very happy, lightening their pockets. Everything's going wonderfully. The police constable has nothing to do but stroll around whistling to himself, until one day, when the town's post office suddenly burns down. And in doing so, it unleashes a scandal of what at the time was considered epic proportions. The post office was first spotted ablaze just after sunset in October, and although the townsfolk fought bravely to douse the flames, the post office burned to the ground overnight. Fearing the postmaster and his 2 assistants to be victims of the blaze, the village constable enlisted 2 trusted men in sifting through the rubble. Then when he was finished, he announced both good and bad news. The good news was that no human remains had been located among the ashes, meaning the postmaster and his assistants were no doubt still alive. The bad news, on the other hand, was that they appeared to have absconded with over £1,000 belonging to the town's post office savings bank. The trio consisted of the postmaster, a Mr. Dalgish, who was a middle-aged bachelor, and 2 spinsters, Mrs. Robertson and Mrs. Mackenzie. Since none had any family in the village, it stood to reason that they'd be inclined to abscond. But the village was still shocked to its absolute core, as it constituted the town's most high-profile crime since the 1700s, when a gang of smugglers murdered the village officer while bringing goods to shore. At a village church service one Sunday, the vicar invited the town's policeman to address his congregation. Constable McAllister announced that he was doing everything he could to bring the trio to justice and return the stolen money. He was even working in conjunction with police forces in Glasgow and Belfast, and that officers in Glasgow believed that they were hot on the trio's trail. Not even a week later, Constable McAllister had more good news for the congregation. Police had raided a home in Clyde Bank, believing it to be the missing trio's safe house, and by the looks of things, Dalglish, Robertson, and Mackenzie had fled just minutes prior, but they left behind a large bag of banknotes. The post office savings money had been recovered. Now naturally, the money's return was the cause of much celebration around Strone, celebrations the pub landlords were only too happy to facilitate for their own financial gain. But it was all a lie. The truth didn't come out for another 25 years, not until one of the men who helped Constable McAllister sift through the rubble of the post office was on his deathbed. Constable McAllister himself had long since passed away following a short but valiant battle against an aggressive cancer, and had resigned to take the secret to his grave. Yet one of the men he trusted to do the same eventually proved he could not. He was said to have expressed a deep remorse at helping tarnish the good names of two innocent women in Mrs. Mackenzie and Mrs. Robertson. Because not only had they not been involved in any kind of plot to rob the post office's savings, there had been no such theft at all. According to him, this is the true story of what happened the morning after the fire. Having been up most of the night trying to put out the fire, most of the village was still asleep during the dawn hours. This gave Constable McAllister and his two hand-picked men plenty of time to comb through the ashes of the post office alone, which is how they found the bones of the postmaster along with his two assistants. The men were obviously bemused as why the trio hadn't escaped once they realized there was a fire. The post office was a relatively small building, so it's likely they noticed something burning fairly quickly. But upon examining the post office's two doors, they discovered both had been locked tight. And not only that, but the keys appeared to have been in the clothing of the postmaster himself. Since the scene didn't make any sense, the constable asked his two pals to keep watch over it while he gained access to the postmaster's home. He intended on searching his home for clues to what had happened. He didn't have to look past the kitchen, though. On the table, Postmaster Dalglish had left an extensive handwritten note describing exactly why he'd chosen to lock himself and his two assistants in the post office before personally setting it on fire. And the note was long and rambling, but the essence was this. Dalglish believed his two assistants were, as he phrased it, no longer who they claimed to be. He claimed they posed a significant threat to the people of Strone, as well as the wider world, and since their power meant that they could not be outmatched in a head-on confrontation, Dalglish explained that he had no choice but to use the only means available to him. He would suddenly lock the post office, set it on fire, then keep the two beings, the word he used, from escaping before they died from smoke inhalation. McAllister later told one of the men guarding the post that it was the single most disturbing thing he'd seen put to page, the ramblings of a madman. And if word spread of what the postmaster had done, there was no telling how it'd affect the village and its people. And as I mentioned earlier, a big portion of the village's income came from the nearby golf course, and if the wealthy stopped patronizing it while staying in the village hotels and drinking in the village pubs, then it'd have a terrible effect on its economy. There was also the matter of reputation, something which was far more important back then than it is now. These days, people are all about exposing and talking and therapizing, but back then, and I hope you don't mind if I try to coin a phrase, but a stiff upper lip was valued far, far higher than a wobbly lower one. But above all, Constable McAllister knew that having such a terrible murderous insanity visit Strone would have an indelible effect on its people for generations to come. There'd be rumors of hauntings, the story would traumatize children, and all kinds of penny dreadful journalists would come slithering around, poking their snouts into places they didn't belong. And so, Constable McAllister made what you might call an executive decision, and covered everything up, sacrificing the reputations of the deceased for the reputation of the village. A dying man spoke his piece and the secret was out, but since it was only spoken around a few choice relatives, it didn't exactly spread like wildfire. Instead of spreading overnight, it took years of quiet whispers for the truth to spread, and even then, many dismissed it as a ghastly rumor spread by bored school children. But my granddad, on the other hand, he swore by it. He said that one night, in the year before his family moved themselves to Glasgow, someone dug up Mrs. Mackenzie's grave in the middle of the night. It must have taken them all bloody night to do so, but I don't think they neglected to fill the grave back in or put the lid back on the coffin through lack of time. It was to prove that the grave of old Mrs. Mackenzie, whose remains were supposed to have been buried after perishing in the post office fire, was empty. I grew up in the late 80s and early 90s in rural Minnesota, and I guess in a lot of ways, my childhood was a lot like any other kids out there on the plains. Now, I watched a lot of TV, went to church with my family wherever we could, and me and my brother even had ourselves a Commodore 64. But then, since we grew up in what could only be described as a strict and very insular religious cult, TV consisted of purely faith-based programming. Whenever we could meant every day and twice on Sundays, and even our Commodore games had to be scripture-based as nothing remotely secular was permitted. And the best way I can describe it, it was like living in a bubble, or maybe more like a snow globe in the winter times. Now, we were part of one group and then another, and then one day, we were on our own and with just my grandpa to shepherd the faithful, which comprised of my own family and a handful of others living on a remote farm complex. Life revolved around the Bible and farm work, and we started mornings at 5:30 a.m. with communal prayers in the big old barn the men had painted black and repurposed as a chapel. And we prayed to God to protect us through the impending end times, but then if someone got sick, we dedicated a lot of prayer time to them. And boy did we need to, because my grandpa called us to reject all forms of modern medicine in favor of purely spiritual healing. Now, he called it the devil's crutch, and that a person who utilized it was wearing their lack of faith like a badge of honor. And it's two such incidents which shaped my belief system growing up, one for better and one for worse. I remember the winter my little brother came down with something that I now realize was probably pneumonia. We prayed day and night while my grandpa laid hands on him, trying to draw out the demons that so plagued his body. We even fasted for a whole day, as penitence and flagellation were believed to be very powerful methods of what grandpa called expiation, but which I came to understand was punishing oneself before God. There were no doctors, no antibiotics, just anointing oil and spoken prayer around his body, and then when he pulled through, Grandpa declared it a miracle. Now, looking back, it was probably just sheer luck that my brother survived his bout of illness, and we were indescribably happy that he had. But not every child survived the winters, and I remember attending not one, but 2 winter funerals before the age of 10, where the coffins laid to rest were heartbreakingly small. Now, we didn't report any births or deaths to the county, and I'm pretty sure Grandpa found a way for us to avoid paying taxes, too. I know we had money, but aside from things that they could use to indoctrinate us children, we tried to avoid any kind of luxuries, especially modern ones. We did a lot of bartering with nearby farms, and my dad's generation was the last to have things like birth certificates or social security numbers. Outsiders were considered worldly, which, contrary to what the word actually means, was not a good thing to us on the farm. The faithless were to be pitied and evangelized from afar, but never trusted or mingled with. Our little cloister had to be absolute, so there was no public schools, no trips into town without strict supervision, and no friends beyond the kids from the other families who lived with us. Daily life was a mix of joy and fear. Summers meant berry picking and swimming in the creek, with bonfires where we'd sing and share testimonies of faith. But all that was to distract us from the fact that we were right in the middle of the end times, and the outside world was about to crumble in Satan's grip. Winters were harsh, huddled around wood stoves or memorizing scripture by flashlight whenever the generators were on the fritz. You think Christmas time might be an excuse to live a little, but Grandpa declared it to be co-opted by the greed of the faithless. We got together on Christmas to have dinner and pray together, but the rest was spent in the big black chapel, praying in thanks for the birth of our Lord and Savior. And I find it strange when people these days talk about the 90s, in the sense that outsiders had this shared sense of culture, or what the Germans might call Zeitgeist, or spirit of the times. They talk about Seinfeld, VHS tapes, and MTV, but for me, it was like watching through a cracked fence. We'd catch glimpses of the first Gulf War on the TV, which was terrifying for us because Grandpa considered it as further evidence that we were living through the end times. He said all those tanks and soldiers would soon be turned on us, and by a government that didn't just reject God, but embrace Satan and all his demons. The internet was a way to spy on us. Ruby Ridge and Waco were further proof of a government that hated us, and then forget about Y2K, which was Grandpa's favorite sermon subject for about 3 months straight. We drilled in preparation of government raids, hiding in root cellars with weapons close at hand, to the point that when people talk about life back in the 50s, when fear of Russian A-bombs were at their highest, I think, sounds awfully familiar actually. But now, since I've told you about the event which confirmed my faith, my brother surviving his illness, allow me to tell you about the one which destroyed it. Not long before my 15th birthday, during the fall of 1997, my grandma was making dinner for my grandpa when she suddenly attacked him with a knife for what Grandpa claimed was no earthly reason whatsoever. Looking back on it, I think he said something to her, something which finally drove her over the edge and filled her with a murderous rage. I don't know exactly what that thing was, and it's obviously pure speculation on my part, but whatever it was that happened that day, it sent my grandma into a frenzy. I saw her myself as a group of menfolk dragged her off to the chapel, her home in hospice for the next several weeks, and she was well and truly beside herself. She was kicking and fighting, screaming and hollering, and I only recognized her by the dress that she was wearing too, because the men marching her off to the chapel had to wrap a cloth around her head to keep her from biting them. It was horrifying to watch, and all I could do was run to my mother to ask her what was going on. At the time, she didn't know, and it was only later that she came to tell me. Grandma had been possessed by a demon. Now, watching my hysterical grandmother dragged away to be shackled to a bed in the old chapel was beyond horrifying to me. And so it might come as a surprise to some of you that I was actually very optimistic in the days that followed. I believed wholeheartedly that Grandma would be fine because not only did she have my grandpa at her side day and night, laying hands on her and reciting scripture, but she had everyone on the farm praying to God on her behalf. We couldn't use the old barn-turned-chapel anymore, and not since Grandma had taken up residence there. But on Grandpa's direction, we prayed in our homes instead and begged God's forgiveness so that he might cast the demons out of Grandma. Now, I had no doubt in my mind that it'd all work. After all, it had worked when my brother was sick. But over time, Grandma didn't seem to be getting better at all, and instead, she only got worse. She slept mostly during the daytime, so school and morning prayers were mostly quiet. But at nighttime, when she woke up, we could hear her screams from our homes. They weren't loud, as the barn was quite a distance away from the residential buildings, but they were always there, lingering in the background after dark, and they'd last until Grandma either lost her voice or passed out around dawn. I didn't find this out until much later on because they didn't tell us kids everything. But one morning, Grandpa came back from tending to Grandma all night, looking pale and deflated. He normally came back tired, but content and confident of Grandma's recovery. But that morning, he seemed anything but. He told my dad, his son-in-law, that he'd come to learn of something during the night, something which terrified him. And I apologize in advance for the theology lesson, but it'll help you understand why Grandpa was so terrified. So, Leviathan is a real scary dude. It's supposedly one of the demon princes of hell, which is a badass title if ever there was one, and in the Bible he's described as having impenetrable scales, so basically invincible, and it also has the ability to breathe fire like a dragon, even though it likes to dwell in the ocean. Make that make sense, I guess. But that means, from a purely fundamentalist Christian perspective, Leviathan is the very last demon prince that you'll want to be invaded by. His impenetrable scales make it very hard to dislodge him from a host's body, and his breath of fire denotes an extremely corrosive effect on said host. But then, again, some of you might be surprised at how happy Grandpa was when he realized this. You see, he had no doubt in his mind that God would grant him the power to defeat Leviathan. After all, he was on the righteous path. But what's more, the Bible prophesies that the torturous serpent, denoting Leviathan, will be served up to the righteous during the end of days. Basically, Grandpa believed God was granting him the opportunity to defeat the demon prince Leviathan, serve it up to the righteous, and bring about the end of days. Obviously, in this context, end of days simply refers to the rapture, which, from a fundamentalist Christian perspective, is like the best thing ever, I guess. And so now you understand why Grandpa was so terrified when he realized Grandma wasn't getting better. It wasn't just that he was losing her, it's that if Leviathan really was about to claim his wife's soul, it was because God had deemed him unworthy of the honor and had promptly deserted him. And if God had deserted him, then he'd deserted us all. I obviously wasn't privy to this information, but I felt Grandpa's fear. We all did. We heard it in his sermons. We read it in the lines on his face after those late nights praying at his screaming wife's bedside. But above all, we felt it when he had us encircling the barn, man, woman, and child, to pray aloud for Grandma's mortal soul. She screamed and wailed throughout that whole affair, yelling things like, "He's the devil, you need to get out, get far away from here." And at the time, we thought they were the words of a demon prince. And now, I think they might have been the sanest words to grace my ears in all my young life. And when we were done praying, we all went back home to pray some more before dinner. We ate in silence, trying not to hear the screams, as that monster I called a grandpa resorted to quite literally trying to beat the devil out of my poor suffering grandmother. And finally, after weeks of waiting and worrying, my parents told me it was time to wish Grandma goodbye. We all lined up outside the barn and went inside in our 2s and 3s, and it was quiet by then. Grandma was too weak to scream anymore. And so after we shuffled up to the grubby old mattress that she was lying on, she didn't say a word. She was looking at us, but I don't think she saw us, you know. I think Grandpa might have done something to her head, and I don't know what, but something bad. All she did was take shallow breaths and stare at us blankly as we said our tearful goodbyes and then walked out of that barn. Grandpa stood watch the whole time, looking empty-eyed and defeated. He was a man who'd failed, a man whose God had deserted him, and it ended up being the end of him. After Grandma passed away and we held a little funeral for her after laying her to rest in our secret cemetery, Grandpa went into a period of deep prayer. The chapel stayed off limits as Grandpa would head inside every day and kneel by the side of that old mattress to pray for Grandma's soul. At least, that's what we thought he was doing. But looking back on it, I think it was more like he was going there to starve himself and reflect on what he'd done with his life. He lost weight, his sermons got shorter, and we'd see him out of the chapel less and less and less, until one day, I heard that he got up early in the morning, wandered off into the woods, and was never seen again. My dad, who took over his duties as his male heir, claimed that he must have been taken by the angels to go be with Grandma. I don't know exactly what had happened to him personally, but I can hazard a guess. Once he was gone, things stayed the same for a little while, but with my dad at the helm, things started to get much more lax around the farm. One big contributing factor was our need for an attorney, and someone had the bright idea to groom one of us kids as the farm's pro bono attorney after pitching in to put us through college. Well, since the oldest and smartest kid was me, I'm not bragging, I'm just saying, I was picked to be the farm's undercover agent in the outside world. Get educated, become an attorney, come home and defend the farm. And this was their plan anyway, but needless to say, it didn't work out. If seeing what they did to Grandma planted the seed of doubt in my mind, going to college poured a whole bunch of water all over it. I had to pick a private Christian college. I couldn't pick anywhere, but transitioning from a fundamental Christian homeschool environment to an actual college just tore my whole worldview apart. I still believe in God, in a manner of speaking anyway, but at college I encountered all kinds of Gnosticism, Mandeism, and Manichaeism, and it had me questioning everything, not just what I'd been told by Grandpa and my parents. Then the more I realized I'd been taught a lie, the more I realized my grandma hadn't simply passed away. She'd been murdered. and I entered a period of deep, clawing depression. Not just because my entire worldview had collapsed, but because it was too late to bring my grandpa to justice. The only thing that gave me even the smallest flicker of hope was the idea that my parents, along with the others who'd kept Grandma starved and confined to the chapel, could taste a small portion of that same justice. I was planning on cutting them off anyway, at least until I could find it in my heart to forgive them what they'd done to me. But when I called the cops in that area and told them all about what had happened with my grandma, I knew that they'd do more to rubber stamp that family divorce than anything I could possibly think of. The cops paid them a visit, asked some questions, and concluded that there was very little chance of gaining any convictions, given the man with all the answers was now deceased. I figured that was the case, so I wasn't too disappointed, but the tension I felt when my parents' letters started appearing in my school mailbox was on another level. I had to deny it was me. I couldn't come clean until I'd finished my education, and I actually didn't come entirely clean until I'd saved enough money to pay my college back and could walk away from my family with only a small souvenir of guilt. I just wish I had the ladyballs to do it in person, because when it came time to confess my attempt to get them arrested, I could only bring myself to do it by letter. I didn't have to fear the flurry of correspondence that would have come if I hadn't added a little postscript, one which detailed me moving someplace they'd never, ever find me. But I sometimes imagine how furious my father was. But furious or not, he cashed that check, and with that, I bought my freedom. As I said earlier, I still believe in God, just not in any sense my grandpa would ever sanction. I honor my mother and father by praying for them, not every night, but most nights. I don't know if they've seen the error of their ways or even if that old farm still exists anymore. I just know I can't be friendly with a man who had a hand in the murder of his own beloved mother. I can't tell you my name or where exactly I am currently, but know that I am a young woman who grew up in a small Siberian village called Pashinya. Pashinya was home to around 500 people, families who had been there for generations. We had a difficult time living from the land while the rest of Russia seemed to rush past ahead of us in politics and technology. Winters were terrible, with temperatures dropping as low as negative 40 degrees Celsius or even lower. Snow would pile up so high that we would have to make tunnel paths between the houses. We would burn wood or coal in our stoves to stay warm, and cars had to be left running all night sometimes just to keep the engines from freezing. Summer was better, much better, but there were still things which made it hard, like the middle of summer where there was daylight for almost a week, or the swarms of mosquitoes that plague us at night and leave us with bites. But summer also gave us the chance to gather berries or fish in the rivers, because even during the easier times of the year, our lives revolved around survival. As the oldest daughter in a family of 5 children, I helped Mama with household chores from a very young age. I would help milk the cow, feed the chickens, and I would help chop firewood too. And this was a very important part of our lives because the only heating that we had came from a traditional Russian stove made of bricks. Once the sun had risen, we would bake bread and make kasha, a kind of buckwheat porridge, for our breakfast. Our school was a one-room building a few kilometers away, and we were taught math, Russian literature, and history. But that history was simply a mix of Soviet propaganda and horror stories from the early 90s when everything fell apart after perestroika. And after school, I'd help tend the vegetable garden in summer or mend clothes by candlelight in winter. Meals were simple: potatoes, cabbage, pickled mushrooms from the forest, and whatever meat Papa could hunt or trade for. My grandmother, a tough babushka who survived Stalin's era, taught me embroidery and herbal remedies and told us how life was better when Papa Yosef was in charge. We didn't have much, and we didn't get internet until 2011, and even then only at the community center. But since electricity was unreliable, blackouts were common, especially in remote areas, so sometimes there was no TV or radio at all. As a teenager, seeing pictures and videos online made me long for life in a big city like Novosibirsk or even Moscow, where a girl could study or find a job. But for Siberian children like me, opportunities in those places were few and far between. Little did I know, but one day I would get my wish. But we have a saying in Russia, one that I hear is very similar to an English phrase: be wary of your desire. One night, in the winter of 2022, the village was awoken by the sound of a very large and very loud explosion. The boom of the explosion woke everybody up, but it sounded very distant as it was so high in the sky. But then, the shock wave hit us, making everything rattle and shake, and you could hear the sound of children crying in their beds all over the village. I called out to my papa to ask him what was going on. He said he didn't know as he put on his boots and clothes and then ran out into the snow to look up into the sky. We all did, some not even bothering to put on shoes or overcoats. And when he looked up into the sky, we saw it. There was a huge fireball, so large I would never have imagined it possible had I not seen it with my own eyes, and it lit up the sky like hell itself had replaced the clouds. We all stood there watching as the flames burned out, churning out smoke so thick it blocked out the moon. And then, the first pieces of debris started falling to earth. It was just small pieces at first that pitter-pattered off the roof of our homes like raindrops, but then the larger pieces started to hit the ground too, and those did not sound so pleasant, especially not the pieces that screamed as they burned. We had to take cover in our homes as pieces of whatever had exploded above us smashed into our houses. It was the most scared I had ever been in my life, and my mother and father used their own bodies to shield us as large pieces of metal began smashing into the house. I have a memory of my father rushing to soak a blanket in water before throwing it over a piece of flaming debris that had smashed through our roof. He stopped our home from burning to the ground, but others were not so lucky. 8 people lost their lives that night, and almost twice the amount of homes burned to the ground. In the morning, we looked outside and gasped at the destruction. We were used to taking care of ourselves, so we did not expect any help from the local government, not for weeks or even months anyway. So when a large number of soldiers arrived that very same day, we were all very happy. But they were not there to help us. Not really. And the first thing that they did was tell us to stop attempting to clean up and repair our homes. They were not there to help us rebuild our homes. They had arrived to take us away from them. They explained it was too dangerous to stay there, and that if we joined them at a camp that they had arranged for us, they could feed us and treat our wounded until it was safe to return again. This we welcomed much more readily, and the army were true to their word as conditions at the camp were good. Their medics treated our wounded, and we were all interviewed by the same pair of officers who were very sympathetic and consoling in their questioning. We had suffered a terrible tragedy, and they simply wanted to figure out what had happened. They also assured us that our home would be rebuilt, and we'd be able to return as soon as it was safe to do so. But this was just one of the many lies to us, and soon it became clear that something strange was going on. Apart from a few particular incidents, we were never treated poorly by the soldiers or their officers, but they did make it clear that the additional medical examinations that we were subjected to were not voluntary. People who had cuts, bruises, or broken bones treated were being dragged back into the medical tents to have their blood drawn and their bodies examined. This happened to everybody too, not just those that had been hurt by the falling debris, and it happened again and again and again. They were testing for something, and they would not tell us what they were testing for. And after weeks of this, of living in tents and eating military food, there was a small rebellion in the camp, and we demanded to be able to return to our homes. The high-ranking officers told us that that area had not been repaired and rebuilt yet, so it was not safe for us to return, but we were sick of being told this. My dad said repairs would take no more than a week at most if everybody shared the work, but Army engineers had supposedly been working on it for 3 weeks and with nothing to show for it. In the end, the high-ranking officers told us that they would figure something out, and we took this to mean that they were returning us to Pashinya. Instead, they announced that we were being moved to a suburb outside Moscow called Mutishi. After a journey of many days by train and road, we arrived at our new home, a towering apartment block surrounded by many others just like it. But once closer, we saw ours was much different. There was a fence and guards. Medical facilities had been set up on the bottom floor. Although we were supposedly free to come and go, a person needed a series of military approvals to do so, which made things impossible for people who wanted to leave. And the same routine played out for us. More military food, more medical tests, and more interviews with different officers about what we saw in the sky that night. And I told them the same story over and over. Explosion, fireball, debris, then terror. And there was nothing more I could tell them, because that was all I knew. But still, they asked me many questions, like they were waiting for me to say something that would finally satisfy them. Now, for weeks, we were told that Pashinya was finally being rebuilt after the engineers had cleared away all the rubble and debris. But even when they said it was finished, they still found reasons to keep us in that apartment block. My father applied for a leaver's permit again and again and again, and then over and over he was told, no, you have not the right paper, or no, you did not complete this paper properly, and had to go back to start again. I remember my mother crying one night and asking if we could ever get to leave that place. And then one day, my father came back to our apartment with a big smile on his face and told us we were leaving. I only found out later, but my father told me that he had found 2 guards doing something that they shouldn't have. He didn't say exactly what that thing was, only that they would be in a lot of trouble if their officers found out what they were doing. The 2 soldiers asked my father what he wanted in order to keep quiet. Apparently, we were too special to simply murder to keep us quiet, and he told them he wanted to leave with his family. My mother was terrified. She believed it was a trick and that the soldiers would murder him. But it was no trick. Their word was true, and the next time my father applied for a leaving permit, it was granted. We were only the 3rd family to be permitted to leave the apartment block, and when my father met with the father of another family, he was warned that things were not over for us. The man was working as a garbage collector to earn enough money to travel back to Pashinya, as the government would not give him the money themselves for him to travel. Another sign that they did not want us to return. But that was not all. He realized that whenever he left the apartment that they were renting for just a few rubles a week, he was being followed. Sometimes by 2 men in a car, and sometimes by 1 man just walking, but he was certain of it. Papa said that then he made a decision that he would leave Russia and seek asylum in another country. I can't tell you which country this is for reasons of personal safety, but we were very happy to be granted a hearing based on claims of medical experimentation. Papa said the person he talked to from the government here was appalled when they heard about what we had all been through, and Papa even spoke to another man from the government who asked more questions about the explosion. We've been waiting for our application to be processed for a long time now, but we are very sure that asylum will be granted to us. Sometimes I worry it will not, and we will be forced to live in another place for another long time while we wait once more, just like in the camp and the apartment. But this is only my 2nd biggest fear, returning to Russia. My first is what will happen if Russia comes for us. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. Check out the link down below for the new video. And thanks so much, friends. And remember, oh yeah, Happy New Year, I guess I could say.
A few years ago, I moved to a new city, the outskirts of the city, to be more specific. It felt a lot more like a small town, with houses more spread out and things being really quiet and calm. The house I bought was small but nice. I knew nobody before moving there, and I wasn't exactly a social butterfly, so I just kept to myself most of the time. A few days after moving in, though, a knock came at the front door. I was in the middle of unpacking still, so I got up and answered it. The man was a tall, older guy with black hair and a patchy medium beard. He introduced himself as Todd, a neighbor from a few doors down. He wanted to say hi and welcome me to the neighborhood. I appreciated the gesture, reciprocating the friendliness and continuing the small talk for a few minutes. He asked some basic questions just to get to know me. All the usual ones, like why I moved, where I moved from, and if I moved with anyone. In the context of being a new neighbor, these didn't seem like off-putting questions at all. He mentioned he lived with his wife, Sarah, and enjoyed the peace and quiet of the neighborhood. After our short talk, he left me to finish moving in. Todd seemed like a nice guy, just trying to be a decent neighbor. He was at least 20 or 30 years older than me, so I knew we wouldn't become good friends or anything, but it was nice to know someone friendly was around. The next few days, I settled in, taking walks around the neighborhood and just getting used to the new area. Oddly, it was hard not to notice that nobody was ever outside. Every time I looked around, or walked around, I never saw any neighbors on their porches or in their yards. The whole town felt hollow, empty in a way that made me feel out of place. Honestly, it was kinda depressing. But around 4 one afternoon, Todd came by again. He wanted to let me know that he and his wife were having a get-together with a bunch of the other neighbors for dinner that night at 7:30 at his place. He said it'd be a great opportunity for me to get to meet all the other nice people around here. I definitely wasn't expecting this invitation from everything I'd seen, or I guess from what I hadn't seen. I figured everyone just kept to themselves, like I usually did, but it seemed like this might be one of my only chances to get to meet people, so I accepted the offer. He said he looked forward to seeing me there, then left. I was excited, but mostly nervous about meeting a bunch of people. I knew it'd be good for me though. Come 7:30, I got ready and started walking over to his place. The whole neighborhood was dark and silent. Peaceful, but also a little strange feeling. Again, giving that hollow sense, like I was somehow all alone. As I got up to Todd's place, it looked the same. Inactive, and no cars or anything near his home. I headed up to the door. It was already cracked open, but I still knocked on it anyway. Todd immediately yelled from inside for me to come on in and make myself at home. His voice echoed through the halls, and it was real quiet in there. No other voices, or even sounds of movement. Not what I expected from a whole neighborhood get-together. I took a few steps in. His home had very moody lighting, making it dark and shadowy in all the rooms. I headed down to the kitchen where I heard Todd's voice come from, but when I got there, it was empty. He wasn't there. I called out his name, and then I called out his wife's name, and got no response from either. And then I noticed there was nothing even in the kitchen. No food on the table, and no signs of any sort of get-together. And the realization set in that nobody else was here. Then, all of a sudden, I heard the front door slam shut. It startled me, and I quickly called out Todd's name again, only to still be met by the disturbing silence of his home. I walked back to the end of the hallway, confirming the front door was now shut. I felt the sense of imminent danger, of fear creeping into me that, up until that point in my life, I'd never felt before. I started hurrying up to the front door, and as I did, I heard a couple steps from somewhere in one of the rooms behind me. I didn't waste any time turning to look. I got up to the door. It was locked in 3 different places, which told me this definitely wasn't some sort of accident. As I undid all the locks, Todd called my name out and asked where I was going. I could hear him quickly approaching behind me, his voice getting deeper and less friendly with every word he spoke. I got the door open and sprinted back home. I debated calling the police, but ultimately decided I would and let the officers figure out whether or not he had intentions. I'm glad I did, because a couple minutes after making it home, Todd showed up, banging on my door and peering into my windows from outside. He left before the officers made it though, but things only got even weirder from here. In the questioning from the cops, it turned out Todd had never planned any get-together with other neighbors, and didn't even have a wife or live with anyone named Sarah. He lived there alone for over a decade. Basically, everything he told me was a lie, just some fabricated story to get me to feel comfortable going over to his house. But unfortunately, nothing could be done about it, because there was no way to prove he was trying to do anything bad. Everyone, including the cops, knew it was all way too odd for him to be completely innocent, but it didn't matter. There was nothing they could do. I moved away from there as soon as possible. Every so often, I'll check up on that guy, looking up his name and hoping he'd been arrested or something, because I know if he isn't, he's just gonna find another victim to lure into his home. What he plans to do, or planned to do to me, I hope he can never follow through on. I used to live in an unnoteworthy, simple neighborhood right in the center of a regular old town. Most of the families living around there had been there for years, if not decades. I was in the same boat, having grown up there, and had the house handed down from my parents when they moved away. This was in my third year living in that house. At some point during the fall, a new neighbor moved into one of the houses across the street from mine. I wasn't the type to go introduce myself or anything like that, but I saw him moving his stuff out of a U-Haul, and he looked like any other ordinary guy. A week after he moved in went by with nothing else to note, until one night I got home from work and saw the guy standing outside my home. I recognized him right away, seeing it was the new neighbor, but he didn't seem to be walking by or walking up to my house. Just standing on the sidewalk, looking at it. I pulled into the garage and got out to go say hi and see what was going on, but in the 20 seconds it took me to get out, he was already gone. He must have hurried away. I found it really unusual, but didn't think too much about it. I had tomorrow off as well, so if he was just stopping by to say hello or ask me something, I'd at least be home to answer the door. I went about my night, and kind of surprisingly, I forgot about the guy really quickly. He didn't even cross my mind again until morning. While I was outside grabbing the mail, I just happened to look across the street at his house for a second. Didn't look like anything was going on, no lights on or anything. Though just before I looked away, I caught a glimpse of something move in the upstairs window. I did a double take, but all that was left were the blinds, shifting back and forth, like he'd just been standing there, maybe watching me. I got a little unsettled, but I got my mail and went back inside. Could have been a coincidence, or him just scoping out the new neighborhood. I tried to not worry myself. I spent the day doing chores I'd been putting off, then just chilling, watching Netflix, YouTube, all the regular stuff. I did occasionally peek out the windows, just to see if he was out there. Sort of a gut feeling I kept having, that I was being watched. Every time I looked though, I didn't see anything. Once the sun set, I thought surely I was good for the night, But I did one more look out the window, and that's when I saw him again. He was standing at the end of my driveway. I don't know what it was about the way he was standing, but for some reason I was sure he'd just come from the top of my driveway, like he was close up to my house just a moment ago. I went to the front door and opened it, walking out toward him. I wasn't trying to come off as angry. If anything, I think I was being too friendly. I just wanted to ask him what was up and make sure everything was cool. But as soon as he saw me, he started walking down the sidewalk, pretending like he was just going for a stroll around the neighborhood. I called out a couple times, only to be ignored. So once I got halfway down the driveway and realized he wasn't going to turn around, I just gave up and went back inside. Now I was really sketched out. I thought I had to be missing something. New neighbor guy, constantly looking at my house and even caught staring at me from his window. It was all so creepy and happening for seemingly no reason at all. I stayed up for another couple hours. I saw nothing else, but I still didn't feel great when I went to bed. Took a while to fall asleep, still with that aching gut feeling that I was being watched. I don't know how, but I did manage to pass out at some point. Although I woke up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat. My whole body sat up quickly, and I felt incredibly uncomfortable, like something was going on. Yet, the whole house was silent. I was so awake though, eyes wide open, and heart beating rapidly. I turned the lamp on next to me and looked around. Everything seemed okay. The room was quiet, and it honestly looked like nothing was happening, but that sinking gut feeling that I was being watched still remained, still pressuring me to not write this off as nothing. I got out of bed and went up to the door. I reached out to open it, but in the act of unlocking it, I had this feeling that what I was doing was wrong, that maybe I shouldn't just unlock it and look around. So I left it locked, and instead put my ear up to the door. After a moment, I could hear soft creaks in the hallway. Wasn't sure if it was the house or something else, so I knelt down and looked under the door. The lights weren't on out there, but I saw nothing on the other side of the door. I stayed knelt down for a few seconds, and then something suddenly moved past it. I jumped back, trying not to make a sound. The creaking instantly stopped. He heard me. After a moment of hesitation, several loud footsteps moved along the floor and right up to the other side of the room. I was still in shock, trying to be as quiet as possible, sitting up against the front of my bed. I could see the shadow of his boots under the door. They started shifting around. And then, suddenly, I couldn't see anything. The whole bottom of the door was covered up by something. I leaned a bit closer. It took a second to make out what it was, but just barely. I saw an eye looking back at me. He was looking under the door. I jumped up, ran around, and got my phone. My hands were shaking so badly, it was difficult to even dial 911. I could hear him moving around outside the room too, thumping on the floor. It seemed that by the time the police were on the way, and I was done with the phone call, he was gone. The whole house was quiet again. I didn't risk checking around though, just in case he was hiding. When cops arrived, they found the house to be empty. I immediately told them my suspicions of the neighbor across the street from me. They went over and talked to him. It was clear he'd been awake for a while when he answered the door, despite it being 2 a.m. Apparently, one thing came to another, and the guy blew his cover, accidentally admitting to something he shouldn't have known. They took him in and were able to get the full story out of him, confirming he was the one that broke into my home that night. And he'd been watching me for a lot longer than I was aware of. It wasn't clear how he even found me, or even why me in general, as we had never even met before. Cops found his search history, having my name in it several times over the course of the last month, even prior to him moving to the neighborhood. There's a chance he even made the move, specifically to be right across from me. He had some other similar weird stalking cases in the past, so they didn't let him off easy. Shouldn't have to worry about him for a long time, but I still haven't gone a day without thinking about it. It really sucks not having all the answers that I want. He must have broken into my home that night for a reason other than to just stalk me. I think he had some horrible intentions, and I was lucky my gut feeling kept me from opening my door. In my late 20s, I moved a few towns over for work. The experience went fairly smooth, I thought. I settled in at my new job really well, and I managed to find a decent apartment quickly and move what little I had into it. The building was small, just 6 units and only 2 per floor, so essentially there was just a flight of stairs going up to each story, where there were 2 doors across from each other for the 2 rooms on each floor. I was on the top story, and the woman who lived across from me was the one who gave me the tour. I think she owned a couple units in the building. The woman was older than me, I think around 45, and she wasn't friendly or unfriendly. She was very non-expressive, sort of monotone, and didn't seem to care about her appearance either. She had long shaggy hair and a tired, mute look over her face every time I saw her. The apartment room was nice enough for me to not care though. Honestly, I thought I'd never really see her anyway. But I couldn't have been more wrong. On my first full day of work after the move, I came home late at 8 p.m., heading up the stairs and found the woman standing outside the door to my room. I was so tired from the long day, and also not expecting to see her, that I couldn't form a sentence. I definitely made things a bit awkward, as she looked at me with that dead stare she always had, and then she asked if this was when I usually got home from work. I thought that was an odd question, but I just said I wasn't too sure because I'd just started the job recently. Without even acknowledging my answer, she turned, opened her door, walked into her room, and slammed the door shut behind her. I didn't know if she was meaning to have that much attitude, or if she was mad at me for some reason, but I just headed inside my unit. I was too tired to give it much thought, and didn't even make dinner before falling asleep. I must have slept pretty good, because I was passed out until 6 a.m. when I was woken abruptly by a loud knock at the door. I jumped out of bed, completely dazed and startled by it. The knocks kept coming, so I had no choice but to walk over and open the door. The woman was standing there, looking the same as always, almost like a walking corpse. "Can I help you?" I said groggily, still trying to wake up. She made this really strange smile, surely fake, and asked a really weird question. She wanted me to come over to her place after work tonight. There was still no emotion in her voice, which gave it a really unsettling feeling. Something wasn't right about this. I didn't know exactly what she meant by coming over after work, like dinner or what, but I tried to be nice and said I was just going to be busy. Without any further response, she again turned around and went back into her room, slamming the door shut. It being 6 a.m. already, I figured I'd just stay up and get ready for work. I left the apartment at 8 and got home at 7. Thankfully, the woman wasn't outside my door, so this time I was able to get into my unit and rest without any weird conversations. I really wasn't sure what was up with her. I didn't feel worried, more just weirded out by her behavior. Anyway, I made dinner and got in bed at 10. I had my alarm set for 6:45. but was again woken abruptly to pounding at the front door. I got up, already sure who it was. I opened the door, and standing right there was the same woman with the same dull face. And even more strange, the conversation went nearly the exact same as it did the previous morning. She asked the same thing, for me to come over to her place after work, and I made the same excuse. She went back into her apartment and slammed the door, and I was left just confused and uneasy about the whole thing. Her lack of emotions made it impossible to decipher what she was really meaning by doing all this. I stayed up, having a small breakfast and then heading to work. The day was long once again, staying in the office until at least 8, but probably closer to 8:30. I didn't make it back to the apartment until 9:15. The whole lot was empty and quiet. Nobody outside, and all the lights in the building were off, as most people were probably getting in bed by then. I hoped this meant the woman wouldn't bother me tonight, and I could just slip in unnoticed. I parked and got inside, going up the stairs and trying not to be too loud. When I got up to my room, she wasn't there. I sighed in relief and put my key in the door, but something was off. It was already unlocked. I froze for a second, the realization hitting me. She had to be the only other person that could unlock it. But still, in the moment though, I couldn't fully believe it. I mean, the lady was creepy and all, but surely not that creepy. There was no way this was as bad as I was thinking. I opened the door, and I noticed something felt weird about the doorknob as well, but I didn't pay attention, as I had a more pressing situation I was focused on. The door closed behind me as I took a few steps into my apartment. The lights were all off, just like I left them, but my bedroom door was open. I could hear my heart beating as I walked up and looked into my room. The woman was standing next to my bed, her face mostly covered by shadows, but I could still see the dull, emotionless expression she had. I started to mutter, "What are you doing?" But I stumbled over my words when I glanced down at the kitchen knife in her hand. After the moment of shock, I ran for the door. I grabbed the handle and tried to swing it open, but almost lost my footing as I wasn't expecting it to not budge. It was stuck in the doorway. The knob wouldn't even move. I immediately knew the woman had rigged the door so it'd lock me inside with her. In that moment, I suddenly felt adrenaline fill me, and rather than being scared, I was pissed off at whatever this psycho lady was doing. She came at me, still holding the knife, but I don't think she was expecting a fight, because I was very easily able to catch her off guard and get the knife away from her. I held her down and called the police, keeping her under control until they got there. It was only after they got her in handcuffs that I noticed she'd actually gotten a quick slash on the back of my arm. Nothing too bad, but once the adrenaline was gone, it wasn't exactly painless. Anyway, she apparently had some serious disorders and wasn't taking the proper medication for the last several months, leading to her having an episode. That was the excuse I got from her family, but it didn't really change anything. In the end though, everything worked out okay. I was able to handle myself and didn't have any lasting impacts from the whole ordeal. It definitely could have been 1,000 times worse though.
So my mom passed away when I was 8 years old, and it was every bit as devastating and heartbreaking as you can possibly imagine. My dad waited a whole 6 years to start dating, and when he did, he introduced the idea to me very slowly and very carefully. I wasn't very happy with the idea of getting a wicked stepmother, so I was dead against him dating. At least until I met Jen, who ended up being his long-term girlfriend, and Jen turned out to be great. She understood that, and without trying to sound too self-centered here, that the most important component of her relationship with my dad was me. She worked very hard to win me over, and for that I owe her a lifetime of appreciation. She made it clear that she wasn't out to replace my mom because no one could ever do that for me, not really. All she could ever offer was patience, compassion, and friendship. And it was her idea that she and my dad put off moving in together for at least a couple of years, and not just because that distance made me feel much less anxious about her dating my dad, but also because she had a child of her own, a boy of 13 named Braden. I was 15 when Jen and Braden moved in, and Braden was 13, like I said, and I'd met him once or twice beforehand, and while he seemed really shy and quiet, I figured he'd be a good kid if Jen helped raise him. Now, I really felt for him too. Jen hadn't told him that she'd been dating until maybe a couple of months before they moved, purely because she was scared of how bad he'd take it. And so when he first met me and my dad, I really sympathized with how anxious and helpless he must have felt. I figured he'd warm up to us, come out of his shell a little, and then we could be something like a family together. But unfortunately, that turned out not to be the case. Braden never did warm up to us, and while he hadn't been the happiest child prior to his teenage years, by 13, bad seeds were bearing some rotten fruit. Now, I thought that when he had that confidence, his personality would start to show, but I totally made the mistake of thinking that personality would be like his mom's, and so when it emerged, he turned out to be a bratty little asshole, and it was disappointing to say the least. The Braden that showed up after that period of silence was easily one of the most obnoxious people I've ever had the displeasure of meeting, but living with him was a living hell. He had zero concern with being loud at night, he had terrible personal hygiene, and he'd throw these teenage boy tantrums to try and manipulate his mother. It was some of the grossest behavior I've ever seen, from either male or female in my whole life, and I asked Dad why the heck he didn't step in. He said it was complicated, that both he and Jen knew that Braden would not react well to Dad trying to parent him, and so instead, he just put up with it. When I asked how the heck he was so patient with him, Dad said every time he got close to losing his temper, he'd remember just how much he loved Jen and all that anger would subside. But when I asked how I could try and cope with him, Dad just kind of looked off and said, "Well, you can look forward to college, I guess." It helped that we could have a sense of humor about it. I guess we kind of had to keep our sanity, but as time went by, it got harder and harder to see the funny side, especially after I turned 18 and decided to take a year off so I could decide what I wanted to study in college. Braden apparently was flunking high school and only seemed interested in two things: chicken tenders and playing Minecraft. He wasn't as bad as like the tendies meme that you've seen, but Jen really did have to fill the freezer with frozen tenders if she wanted Braden to eat anything, and boy did that kid eat. I think he was pushing 190 by that point, so not huge, but well on his way with the amount that he ate. And the only times that you'd see him was when he came down to put them in the oven and when he came down to take them out again. And the rest of the time, Braden was in his bedroom playing video. And so once I turned 19, I started seriously knuckling down when it came to my college applications. But that meant that I needed to look into getting a student loan, and then, and long story short here, I found out that I was already in debt and was almost $1,500 in the red on a credit card I didn't even know that I had. It was obviously identity fraud of some kind because I hadn't applied for any credit card. But then when I looked into it, I saw something I recognized right away. First off, the company was Microsoft, so I knew all the purchases were like computer related. But when I checked out the actual purchases and what they were, almost all of them said Madden points. Jen and Braden had argued about something called Madden points maybe 3 or 4 months prior, and from what I understand, they were something Braden apparently needed to play his football game. But then it turned out he didn't need them, and it was all just a way of milking yet more money out of people. But when Jen refused to give him any more money and told him to make do with what he'd already bought, he went nuts. It was a whole thing, and it only stopped when Jen threatened to take his Xbox away altogether. But then, it hadn't stopped, because all Braden had done was apply for a credit card in my name, and then spend almost $1,500 of money I literally didn't even have. I was mad, obviously really mad, but I knew I wouldn't have to pay anything. It was literally identity theft. And the only thing was, I had to file a police report if I wanted to sort of convince them that it wasn't just me doing a scam, and that was obviously really bad for Braden. And his mom went ballistic. My dad got involved for the first time, saying that he could go to prison for stuff like that. But then the whole time, Braden's saying, I don't know what you guys are talking about. I swear it wasn't me. Well, it was him, because all it took was a visit from a police officer, and he sang like a canary while crying like a baby. I didn't have to press charges, so I didn't, but that meant that Dad and Jen had to pay off the money, otherwise the credit card company was going to pursue charges instead. And needless to say, they were seriously mad at Braden, but they got even madder when he basically refused to apologize to me. From Braden's perspective, I'd majorly wronged him by trying to get him arrested, which I hadn't, and over something that in his words wasn't even that much of a big deal. And he actually offered to do yard work around the neighborhood to try and cover $1,500. But I digress. He wasn't going to apologize, and it was actually starting to put a strain on Dad and Jen's relationship. But then one night, around 11:30, Braden knocked on my bedroom door and said he wanted to apologize. It was 11:30 at night. I'd been lying there trying to sleep for maybe 15 minutes or so, and I was in no mood to have such a heavy talk with him. But what I did do was thank him. I genuinely appreciated his attempt at reproach, so while at the time I just wanted to sleep, I told him I'd talk with him in the morning so we could make up properly. I wished Braden good night and then rolled over to go back to sleep. But he knocked again and said he wanted to apologize. Now I just responded, Braden, please just go to sleep. I'll talk to you tomorrow. But again, this kid knocks on my goddamn bedroom door again. And I said I wasn't going to tell him again, and I was definitely starting to lose my crap, so I probably sounded like it too. But then Braden says, and in his real aggressive and creepy way, Open your door, Jessica. I want to apologize to you. Braden tried opening my door, forcefully too, but since I've been keeping it locked since the whole credit card debacle, his attempt was unsuccessful. And that's when I realized something was going on, and Braden never intended for some heartfelt apology. I remember sitting up in bed and telling Braden much louder to get the hell away from my door. And I guess this alerted my dad because I heard the bedroom door open down the hallway. I expected my dad to tell Braden the same, to go get to bed and quit bothering me, but all I heard was, "Oh my God," before it sounded like he bolted back into his and Jen's bedroom. Braden started banging on my door while jiggling my door handle, and he also raised his voice and started saying, "Open the door, Jen. Open the freaking door right now." And as you can imagine, I was never about to open my door to him, especially not after hearing my dad say something like, "Oh my God," the way he did. And that made me think that Braden had something in his hand, something that was probably sharp or went bang. Braden was still slamming his fist against my door when I heard my dad suddenly start yelling, "Braden, put the knife down, Braden, right now." I could hear Jen too, yelling for him to stop, but I mostly could just hear Braden screaming and then this sudden sort of wood chipping sound almost from where he was stabbing at my bedroom door with the knife he was carrying. My dad didn't shoot him, thank God, but he sounded almost close, you know? His stepson was in the process of trying to murder his biological daughter, and while he loved Braden's mom, I don't think he'd have any trouble whatsoever in shooting him dead if, say, he managed to barge my door open and get inside. But then, that would have obviously been a huge drama, There's no way Dad and Jen's relationship would have survived that, and heck, maybe he'd even go to prison, or at the very least have stuck with the memory of shooting a kid dead in his own house. And so yeah, thankfully, Braden eventually put the knife down. And then, as his mom screamed at him to go to his room, he started crying. Dad came into my room to see if I was okay, which, yeah, sure, I technically was fine, but not so fine at the same time. He promised me he was going to do something about Braden's behavior, and that his mom said she'd back any play he suggested. And that is how Braden ended up going to military school for 2 years. He ended up going into the army after he graduated because, in a tale as old as time, all he really needed in life was a father figure. My dad always felt bad about not being able to provide it, and he has an okay relationship with Braden these days, but I don't rush to go see him whenever he's home. Now, he might look all square-jawed and dapper in his army photos, but I still see that same kid inside of him, the one that tried to kill me in the middle of the night. Growing up, my brother Nate was my hero. With him, I felt like I could do anything because he'd say stuff like, "If we can send a rocket to the moon, you can learn to ride a bike, Sammy." And that's what Nate wanted to do, go to the moon in a rocket ship, so his big dream was to join the Air Force. Now, I can already hear a bunch of nerds yelling, "NASA doesn't recruit pilots to be astronauts, they're civilian scientists and engineers, blah blah blah." Well, true. But don't go breaking your arm jerking yourself off there, Mr. Know-It-All, because finding that out didn't deter Nate one bit. He still wanted to join the Air Force just as a fighter pilot, with a view to flying test aircraft. Now sadly that didn't work out for him, and things might be a whole lot different if it did. But still, that didn't deter him. Nate was happy just being around test pilots, so he volunteered with the 412th Test Wing at Edwards Air Force Base down in California. None of the stuff that he was working on as an aircraft engineer was classified back then, so he was free to talk about it. And boy, did he talk about it. This was back when they were still testing the F-35, and Nate was having a whale of a time working on it with his buddies. He said he'd be the happiest son of a gun in the whole damned Air Force if he got to see out his career at Edwards. But then came the day that he came home with an announcement. He'd been given a brand new assignment, one he was very happy about. And then when Dad asked where he was headed, Nate got this big grin on his face and said he couldn't tell us. Dad was excited, like majorly so, and he kept joking about Nate going to Area 51 to work on UFOs and hang out with little green men. And we all just laughed, Nate included. He transferred a few weeks later and he still came to visit us, but unlike his other visits, he obviously couldn't say much about what he was doing. He was based out of Las Vegas, and officially speaking, he was stationed at Nellis. But the Air Force flew him out to different sites all across northern Nevada. He wasn't permitted to name any of those bases, but even if he did, there was no official record of them existing anywhere. He stayed with that same unit for a couple of years, and he always seemed happy. But then came the day that he called our parents and said that he'd been placed on medical leave. When he came home to visit, Nate told Mom and Dad not to worry, as he was just exhausted, overworked, and needed a little time off. Apparently, his commanding officer said that he could get him 30 days medical leave on grounds of stress, which meant that it wouldn't eat into his regular annual leave. Nate said that they all took care of each other that way, and he'd be back to work before he knew it. But then, at the end of those 30 days, Nate didn't go back to work, and he had his leave extended by another 30 days. Now, we didn't find out until way later, but not only had he not been to work in months, but he had to go through some kind of medical evaluation to see whether he was still fit for service or not. Dad and him spoke on the phone a few times, but Dad knew better than to ask too many questions. The whole thing was clearly bothering Nate a lot, and Dad figured that he'd talk about it, what he could talk about at least, when he was ready. But then came the bad news. The board had decided Nate wasn't fit for service anymore, and he was discharged with immediate effect. I think Nate kind of knew that that was going to happen, but when he got the news, it was bad. Dad drove out to Nevada to help him move out of the Air Force housing, which obviously wasn't at any of the secret sites he'd worked at. He called saying that Nate was putting on a brave face with these things, but underneath, you could tell that he was in some pretty bad shape. All he'd say was, "I can't do it anymore, Dad," and the Air Force agrees. But there was clearly something going on, and obviously lots that he hadn't and couldn't tell us. Mom and Dad offered him his old room back till he could get back on his feet, which no one thought would be very long since Nate had a nice amount in savings tucked away, it seemed. But I remember thinking the second I laid eyes on him that it was going to be way longer than just a couple of weeks. Nate looked like crap, and I'll be honest, that's putting it kindly. He'd lost a ton of weight since we last saw him, he looked like Billy Bob Thornton, and he obviously wasn't sleeping great, and was honestly feeling like he'd had some kind of personality transplant. It had been at least 9 months since we last saw him, and instead of this confident, outgoing guy showing up on our doorstep, this twitchy, nervous-looking shell did instead. He was still Nate. We still talked football and laughed about old times, but when there'd be lapses in conversation or you'd catch him on his own someplace, there'd be this look on his face like he had the weight of the world bearing down on him. He kept saying how he wouldn't be there long, that he already had an apartment in Eugene lined up, but when weeks turned into almost 2 months of him rotting in his old bedroom, he and our parents started to clash. Dad kept saying how he needed to get help, like from a therapist or psychologist or something, because he was clearly dealing with some kind of mental issue. But Nate said he didn't need to, that he'd talked to enough shrinks and doctors over the past year or so to last an entire lifetime. Dad would ask him over and over to just talk to him, at least about the stuff that he was permitted to, but Nate would just yell back, "I can't. You know I can't." Like he couldn't even touch on what was wrong without violating his non-disclosures or getting carted off to jail. And he'd ended up moving out not long after, but that and getting a job was made real difficult by the fact that on his resume, and thanks to the secret work that apparently he'd been doing, it basically looked like Nate had been out of work for almost a year and with zero explanation for it. He said employers and landlords alike both treated him like he was some kind of bullcrap artist or homeless. They took one look at this skinny, unshaven dude with longish hair who claimed to have worked on classified projects for the Air Force and thought, no dice. He still managed to find a place and a job, I guess after the Air Force sent him a letter of recommendation or something, but going from the Air Force to civilian life is tough for anyone, even at the best of times. And so given Nate's special and rather awkward circumstances, it made it all even the harder for him. And since he and my dad weren't on speaking terms at that point, Nate stayed away for a while, but I'd talk to him via text most days, just checking in on how he was and all of that while talking about the Ducks or the Trailblazers. Sometimes he'd be up and sometimes he'd be way down. And then on one of the weeks that he was way down, I decided, screw it. I'm heading over with some rotisserie chicken and a bunch of drink to cheer this idiot up. And that's what I did. I stopped at this Jamaican place in Eugene and picked up some chicken, and then after grabbing the sodas, I drove over to Nate's place after making sure that he was home. And we just hung out for a while, talking about the usual kind of stuff, and then touching on how Dad wasn't mad anymore and was basically just waiting for him to reach out. He was relieved at that, but that also gave me a window to ask him about the stuff that happened at his job, as in, like, the reasons for his discharge. I told him it was cool if he really didn't want to talk about it, but he kind of sighed and said something about having to talk about it sooner or later, and then started telling me about this mental breakdown that he had after being overworked and overthinking. He talked about it at length, like all the mandatory counseling and psychiatry sessions he had to attend, but there was something about the way he talked when he described the reasons, and having known him all my life, I could tell he was lying. The guy who would have happily skipped sleep to work on airplanes was complaining about being overworked, and I didn't know this at the time, but in a role where the Air Force takes real care not to overwork their airmen, my brother had somehow become the sole exception, I guess. And that's besides the fact my bullcrap detector was going off in a very big way. And so I slowly approached the subject and asked him if he was lying because he had to, or he just didn't want us to know the truth. And this was something that had happened a bunch of times actually. Not because Nate was some big liar or anything like that, more like he had a habit of trying to protect me from painful truths, like the time Grandma fell down and had to go to the hospital. Nate told me that she was just tired when, really, he knew all too well that she was a goner. I cried till Nate said Grandma was fine, how she just bonked her head after falling asleep standing up. He said she'd get her whole head bandaged up in the hospital and then made jokes that she was going to look like a mummy coming out of some big old tomb over in Egypt. Now, he used to take me from crying to laughing in just a few short minutes, but I didn't need protection anymore, and I told him that. I just wanted to know what had happened to him, not his job, him. After gathering his thoughts, Nate started with a kind of disclaimer, saying that he obviously couldn't tell me exactly what he'd been working on, or what he saw, or what he knew, but he could bring himself to talk about how it made him feel, and how he felt, was scared. Nate said that he'd been working on something with a whole team, and then during a simulation they'd been running one day, the team realized something terrible might happen if their little project got working. In fact, not only was the thing obviously terrible, but the more they thought about it, the more they realized just how utterly catastrophic the worst-case scenario might truly be. Nate said it caused a whole thing in their department because some guys didn't seem to recognize what the problem was, while others did, and both groups were at each other's throats over it. There was a whole review. Each group argued their case, and by the end of it, Nate said the people, rightfully in a panic, thought that they had the whole thing wrapped up. The solution was obvious. Radically change the direction of the project or mothball it entirely, because if they didn't, just about everyone was going to be in a whole world of hurt. It seemed like an open and shut case, and even some of the more chilled out members of the team changed their minds and decided the risks were worth paying attention to. But then the review board made their announcement. Continue the test project as planned without any deviations whatsoever. And everyone was stunned. But none more than Nate and his buddies, who as engineers were the first to figure out the practical application of what they were working on, but also what might happen if it all went south. They pretty much led the protests against the review board and commanding officers, and as you can probably guess, the higher-ups didn't like that one bit. There were accusations of insubordination and threats of jail time, as the Air Force threatened to throw the book at the whole test team if they didn't toe the line. They weren't happy about it, but they did as they were told for the sake of their jobs and freedom. But over time, it wore them all the way down to the bone. Nate couldn't tell me the names of the dudes he worked with, but he could tell me roughly what happened to them. He wasn't the first to be put on extended medical leave. It happened to a couple of the other engineers and scientists who'd protested too. The Air Force strung him along for a while, telling him that he'd be back to work in no time after nothing but a cool-off period. But finally, his turn came too, and there wasn't a thing that he could do about it. Nate said that he was still a true believer for a time, and although he'd been kicked out, he got a big payout. And that must have really sweetened the pot, I guess, getting a golden goodbye like that, but Nate still firmly believed that his old COs would see sense and make the right decision. But then not long after moving off base, he ended up talking to an old buddy of his who heard rumors that they were pressing on with the project harder than ever. Nate couldn't believe it, and the stress of knowing his worst fears might come true had him almost losing his mind. And that's why he and Dad were clashing so much. Dad could see it was tearing him up inside, but Nate warned that if he told him what was coming, Dad would think he was crazy. And not only that, if he was foolish enough to repeat what he'd been told, Nate might end up going to prison for a long time. But even if Dad did believe him, there was nothing he could do. There was nothing anyone could do to stop what was coming, and when it happened, life as we knew it would change forever and not for the better. I remember being so freaked out and scared by what Nate was saying that I was like, dude, please tell me you're not serious. I mean, if you can't tell me, okay, but don't just make weird crap up. And Nate exploded. He knocked over his soda from getting up so fast while shouting, "Does it effing look like I'm making this up?" He was red in the face as he went off on a big long rant about how if he told everyone what he knew, and people really understood what frightened him so much, there'd be mass panic, along with riots, martial law, you name it. Society as we knew it would break down completely, and that's before the thing that scared Nate happened. I asked him about things like bunkers and all that stuff, if folks could shelter from it like they would from a nuke, and Nate just shook his head and told me that I didn't get it. It didn't matter if you were on the goddamn space station or in a presidential bunker. Everyone was going to suffer, and in ways they could barely even imagine without being told explicitly. And if you did tell them, well, say goodbye to society, because no one's showing up to work on Monday once they know what's about to happen. I remember sitting there just sort of speechless, basically. I didn't want to think a single word Nate said was true, but he'd never lied to me before, not after demanding he tell me the truth anyway. He also told me if I breathed a single word of what he'd said to anyone we knew, he'd kill me. I promised I wouldn't say a word. Not to anyone we knew anyway, and definitely not to Mom or Dad. I just didn't know how he could sleep at night knowing something was coming that no one could stop. And he told me alcohol helped, but regardless, he didn't have much other choice. The thing that stopped him from going completely crazy was knowing that there were still good people working on those projects and how sooner or later they'd see sense. How they were just individuals, and any pushback they gave would once again be met with the full force of the big blue machine. And so, even though there was hope, it wasn't enough to keep Nate calm or optimistic. He reminded me to keep my mouth shut, but at the end, he thanked me for the talk. And then over the next few weeks, Nate started to get a lot better. He patched things up with our dad, started coming over on Sundays for dinner and football, and it seemed like each and every day he looked and acted a little bit different. He was eating properly again and hitting the gym, and he also got fast-tracked for promotion at the warehouse job that he had, which meant a little more money and a lot more freedom. And so after just under a year of being back home, Nate was practically back to normal again. He was still in touch with his old buddies from the project, the ones who were also discharged, but he seemed to stop worrying and fixating on it like he had before. Nate became a regular part of our lives again, and it seemed like nothing was going to change that. But then came the day that he stopped answering texts or calls, and my parents got so worried they asked me to drive over to check on him. I remember thinking they were just overreacting. Nate had been doing great, and it was good to have his old self back again. Besides, the better he got, the busier he got, and the last time he spoke, he mentioned something about a girl he'd been seeing. But then, when I did drive over to Nate's, there was no answer. And then when I tried the door, I found it was locked. I got nervous right away because in my head, or rather in my worst fears, it was about finding Nate's body. My heart was just about pounding in my chest, and I remember sniffing the air and thinking, okay, no smell of death, this is a good sign. But seconds later, after walking into the kitchen, I saw a note on the table. And seeing the note had fear and terror hitting me like a truck. I could barely bring myself to read it, but when I did, I was so relieved that I felt a lump in my throat. The first line said something like, "Whoever finds this, rest assured, I didn't do that. And as far as I know, I'll still be alive when you find this." I had my hands on my knees like, oh, thank God. And that's about as far as the relief went, though. In the note, Nate explained that he hadn't been doing any better, he just found a way of coping. And it was by finding a way of stopping what he'd previously been working on and with the help of his old friends. Obviously, he didn't leave any real details, just that he was driving up to Washington to meet with an old friend, and he had to leave in the middle of the night in a rental car so the Air Force couldn't tail him. That was the first I'd heard of anyone following or tailing him. I hadn't seen anyone around our parents' place when he was staying there, like any creepy-looking unmarked cars parked at the end of the driveway, and I hadn't seen any at his place in Eugene either. And so, was Nate for real? Or was he just going insane? His note didn't seem crazy, not at all. He said that he wouldn't be home for a while, but when he returned, we'd be the first people that he checked in with. And he also couldn't take his phone with him for tracking reasons, so he apologized for worrying us and making it so we couldn't reach him. There were extra notes at the bottom explaining what to do if a friend found it or if me or my dad found it. We weren't to tell anyone what he was planning, and we were to go on acting like normal. But he did want Mom and Dad to know that he hadn't just run off and he was going to come back. I was kind of relieved at the news that he'd be back, and I was still worried about him, and I wondered where he was going, but I didn't panic. I told Mom and Dad a version of the truth, and very casually told them that Nate was on a sort of adventure vacation out in the wilds and had turned his phone off for no distractions. And they were so used to him being his old self that news of a phoneless vacation didn't worry them at all. And it was only when the Oregon State Police knocked on our door and told them that they had some very bad news for us that they really started to worry. And they were right to worry too, because the news that the state trooper had for us was absolutely devastating. Tragically, Nate had been involved in a car accident while driving up to Washington in the middle of the night, and although the firefighters and paramedics had done everything they could, they figured Nate was dead before they even got there. We were told a drunk driver had smashed into the front of him after crossing over the grass divide, and he was going so fast that Nate was probably killed on impact. And that was a small mercy, I guess, knowing he hadn't suffered too much before he passed. And we heard the other driver had been killed too, only his car had exploded into a fireball and he got burned up in the wreck. Like I said, it made what happened to Nate seem like a mercy in a way, and then came the funeral, and that was rough. Mom took it especially hard. She thought she finally had her son back, only to have him die in some car crash in the middle of the night without ever getting a chance to say goodbye. She stayed grieving for a long time too, and didn't get out of bed once for almost 3 days straight, but the way Dad dealt with it was different. He wanted answers, so while Mom cried and ate food that the neighbors brought over, Dad was on the phone with the Air Force trying to get as much information as he could about Nate's final days there. They ended up sending someone over to the house who explained to my dad that basically they had no record of Nate ever working at any top-secret facilities, meaning he hadn't been told anything that qualified as classified information. And the Air Force kept Nate's medical records sealed, so the guy who visited wasn't allowed to say what the medical leave was for, but he could say that it was the medical condition that caused him to be discharged, which was nothing we didn't already know. I'd already mentioned what Nate said and told my dad how he thought he was being followed, but the guy from the Air Force said that there was no way that could have been the case. It wasn't unheard of for Air Force defenders, their version of military police, to monitor those that they were concerned might give away classified information. But with Nate, that had not been the case because, simply put, he didn't have any classified information to pass on. And after that, Dad didn't know what to think anymore. Thinking Nate had lied to us for all those years almost broke him, and then it was Mom's turn to take care of him when all he wanted to do was drink and go walking in the woods with his gun. I went to go have a talk with him, not telling him all of what Nate said to me, but making it clear that I didn't hear my bullcrap detector going off when he was talking about it. I knew my brother, and I knew when he was lying, and unless he really was insane, crazy enough to believe his own imagination or whatever, then he must have been telling the truth about what he saw and what he knew. But my dad was just like Nate in a way, with his sort of innate trust of authority. And so while he chose to believe his son had been honorable, hadn't lied, and had done the right things, what the Air Force guy said weighed very heavy on him. Myself, I believe every word Nate had told me. I believe something scared him so bad that it cost him his career and almost drove him crazy. Because I believe the military would mess with very powerful stuff that they don't fully understand. I mean, look at that Oppenheimer movie. The scientists figured that there was a chance that they may blow up the entire world by testing their device, but they did it anyway. So with Nate making out that he'd seen something like that, and knowing his track record of honesty growing up, I've got basically no reason at all not to believe him. And sometimes, considering what he wrote in that final note, I start wondering if his death really was an accident, or if someone was so desperate to silence him that they were able to stage his murder as something accidental. And I don't try to think about that much. I've got plenty of other things to worry about, and I don't worry about what Nate said about things going so wrong for so many people because, like he said, there ain't nothing we could do about it if we tried. My name's Abby, I'm from the UK, and I've been a fan of yours for quite some time now. I try to check out the live streams whenever possible, and I love the banter between you and the viewers, but they're often too late for me to hang around for long. Don't change them on my account, I'm just saying. Now anyway, the reason I'm writing to you today is because, well, my brother disappeared. I'd always hoped that I'd never have any reason to write to you, and I should probably say now that my brother's disappearance won't be like any you've read about before, because technically, he hasn't disappeared. It just feels like he has. So my brother's name is Theo, and he was always a bit of a moody one. His favorite film when he was little was Kidulthood, a film about gangs in London, and then he was mad into Top Boy when that came out too. He once got in trouble for skipping school to go home and watch Battle Royale when our mum walked in on him watching it, and she double panicked because not only was he skipping school, but he was doing it to watch these crazy violent films where Japanese schoolgirls get machine gunned. But as our dad said, boys will be boys. He seemed to mellow out a bit once he reached year 9, which I think is like 8th or 9th grade over there, because he had to focus on his GCSE exams. He loved reading about history, so that was by far his strongest subject, and he liked doing Shakespearean plays in English too. All his teachers thought that he'd get good enough grades to continue on to A-level, so we were all really excited about the idea of him going off to uni somewhere and having all the fun associated with that. But then, right at the moment of truth, just as exam week started, Theo decided that he didn't want to sit them. Mom managed to convince him to sit his history exam and do his biology and English exam so he at least had the grades to do his A-levels. But when his results came back, I think he got a D and 2 E's. And so to Mom, Dad, and even his teachers, it was like Theo hadn't even tried. I remember the big argument that erupted on results day. How Dad said, "What were you thinking? Do you know how much resits are going to cost?" Theo's response came in 3 stock lines. "I don't care, I'm not bothered, and what's the point?" And our parents decided that there must be something wrong with him, like mentally or emotionally, and so they sorted him out with a visit from a psychologist or psychotherapist, I can never remember which. And then after a few weeks of sessions, the women told Mom and Dad that Theo was suffering from some kind of depression, as well as a serious sort of behavioral disorder. The psychologist woman recommended he undergo some therapies, and he was going to all these doctors to talk with them, do some brain exercises, and to write down all of his feelings. He was put on antidepressants too, and while he didn't want to take them at first, all it took was a talk with our dad who convinced him to just try them, and Theo seemed only too happy to take them. It wasn't transformational, and we were warned that the process might seem painfully slow, but over the next couple of weeks, I started noticing improvements. He started leaving the house again, mostly just to the shops and back, but it was still an improvement, and we hoped that he might start seeing his school friends again because at least 2 of their families live within cycling distance of our house. But Theo said that he wasn't interested in seeing them anymore because they didn't have anything in common. We were all quite sad to hear that, but Dad wasn't that bothered by it. He said teenage boys could be fickle and emotionless, and reminded us all that all teenage groups get disrupted by the end of secondary school. Theo falling out with his friends was concerning, but in the grand scheme of things, he was doing much better. He made an okay point, I suppose. Theo had been leaving the house more and more, and in addition to getting himself a gym membership. And then as time went by, he landed a part-time job stacking shelves in a supermarket and started talking to a whole new group of friends. But not in person, only online. I say not in person, as he did end up going to see some of them not long after his 17th birthday, but for the most part they either talked via social media or in group chats whenever they were playing Xbox games together, probably. And Theo would end up getting really loud with them sometimes, laughing and making jokes or shouting in excitement whenever they were playing shooting games together. It was really annoying, but me and our parents were so happy to see him socializing and having fun that most of the time we just sort of put up with it. And by the time Theo turned 17, he was doing way better than before. I mentioned that trip that he made to see his friends, but he joined a club too, a shooting club, and at first, Dad wasn't best pleased about this. He ended up driving Theo over one day and talking to the man in charge, and then he got back and seemed completely reassured. Dad said that the guy running it was ex-army, a little bulldog of a man who said discipline, respect, and safety were his top concerns, He didn't let any idiots into his shooting club because his life quite literally depended on that. And so when he said that Leo was quiet, respectful, and took safety very seriously, he was only too happy to have him around. This made Dad really proud, and to us it seemed like the end of a very long and very dark chapter in Theo's life. But then came the night that we were all sitting down for dinner, and everything seemed to just fall apart before our very eyes. Theo had been to shooting club that evening, which usually had him in a good mood, but that evening he seemed a bit subdued. When Dad asked him what the matter was, Theo said that he was getting sick of his job, and then when Dad suggested getting him some hours at his place, he said, "Only idiots work jobs like that for no money." And there was a clatter of cutlery as Dad put his knife and fork down, and then after looking over at Theo, he said, "And what's that supposed to mean?" And that's all I can remember word for word, honestly, because after that, Theo and Dad started going back and forth about how much money he was earning, with Theo saying some pretty horrible things about what he called wages or wage slaves. And the only thing that really stands out in memory, amid a lot of shouting about stuff I just didn't understand, was when Dad said, "Well, what are you going to do with your life then?" And then whatever Theo said in reply sent Dad ballistic. Me and Mom had left the room by this point just to give them some space, but then Theo came bursting out of the kitchen with my dad behind him shouting, "Well, I'm not having you living here if you're going to talk like that. You got a month to move out, and at the end of it, you can go F off." Theo didn't end up moving out at the end of the month. He and Dad had a talk and worked things out. And they agreed Theo was well in the wrong for saying the stuff about Dad's job, and in light of that, he could stay as long as he wanted. But ever since that night when Dad and Theo had that big argument, it was like I noticed how much he changed. He'd always been my little brother, by 5 years by the way, but watching him grow up had always been a joy to me. It was hard watching him go through his depression, and I was proud of him watching him drag himself out of it. But while he'd always been a bit more inclined to all things weird and spooky, he'd always been quite positive and kind-hearted. Whereas after the depression, there was a new and strange sort of nastiness about him. He only seemed to laugh at sort of really negative or terrible things, and the sort of joyfulness he once had about him seemed to just be gone. He spent more and more time online, and whenever I walked into his room, he'd always changed his screen really quick and act all impatient till I left. Or sometimes he'd just shout at me to go away, even when I knocked first to give him his privacy. Now, I remember being quite sad and talking to Mum about it, and she reassured me by saying my Uncle Robbie was a nightmare when he was a teenager, but then grew into a sweater vest-wearing florist, and a thoroughly charming fellow at that. And Theo would grow out of it, sooner or later anyway, and when he did, we'd all be better off for it, and we just had to be patient. A few more months came and went, with Theo having settled into the rhythm of going to work, going to shooting club, and then playing video games with his mates till late at night. He'd start taking driving lessons finally, which Mum and Dad were really excited about. But other than that, he'd spent all of his time in his bedroom. We hardly ever saw him for days at a time sometimes, and Dad started jokingly referring to him as the Shadow. But there were no more racist outbursts or anything like that while gaming. Just the usual aloofness and an almost constant need to be left alone. And I suppose that was our mistake, leaving him alone. We should have been more involved in his life, especially after he said those horrible things about people who worked for a living. But Dad really did think that he'd talked him away from a dark place when they patched things up after their little argument. Well, it turns out he was wrong. Theo hadn't moved on from it, he was just masking, as my Gen Z nephew likes to say. I'll never forget the night that I woke up to the sound of this terrible crashing sound coming from downstairs. And it was like these slow but heavy banging sounds, and just from the noise alone you could tell it was coming from our front door. Thinking the house was being burgled, I jumped out of bed, threw on my robe, and then ran to my dad's room to wake him up. He was already up, obviously, everyone in the house was, and when I met him on the landing, he had his baseball bat in his hand, the one he kept under his bed. Now, he was ready to face down any burglars who smashed their way in, or to at least keep them from coming up the stairs. But no sooner had he called out that there were people in the house, someone cried back, "Armed police," as the door burst open and a load of policemen with guns came pouring into our house from outside. They made me, Mum, and Dad come down the stairs, but Theo hadn't come out of his room. And then as a few policemen started looking around downstairs, a load more ran up the stairs to Theo's room. I didn't see it myself, but I later heard that they found him destroying his computer. Or at least trying to, because from what I understand, you can always pull stuff off of a computer drive even when it's damaged. They took him away with my mum crying, and Dad asked what was going on, and I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. My kid brother being carted off in handcuffs by police with big guns and body armor and helmets. It looked like they were going off to fight a war or something, but they'd come to our house from my little brother. But why? All we wanted to know as the police were taking him away was why they'd felt it was necessary to smash their way into our home to drag away a 17-year-old. We were entitled to know, so they had to tell us once the scene was secure. But then they did, and it really did feel like the words alone knocked the wind out of us, because Theo had been arrested under suspicion of planning the importation of drugs, firearms, and even explosives. Mum and Dad were stunned, but they got Theo a solicitor right away, and it was through him that they found out exactly what he was being charged with. The charges alone were bad enough, but when they found out that he was looking at literally decades in prison, Mum nearly had a breakdown. And that's why Theo had been learning to drive, not because he wanted a car so he was free to get around, but so he could rent a big moving-style truck, drive it down to Calais, and pick up a huge shipment intended for a local gang, who in turn were going to use it to wage a turf war that, given they were trying to import hand grenades, would result in innocent people being hurt or even killed. The police took all Theo's computer and phone stuff away after they arrested him, and after going through everything that was on there, they found all kinds of chat logs relating to this plot. The solicitor Mum hired said the fact a bunch of older guys had groomed him into doing it would work in our favor, as like a mitigating circumstance. But Theo would have to tell the judge how sorry he was, how foolish he'd been, and how he was committed to changing his ways and bettering himself for the future. It amounted to groveling for mercy, but anything to get time off of Theo's sentence, right? Well, wrong. Because even though it meant going to prison for many more years than he would have otherwise, Theo refused to play ball. He pled guilty, but refused to make any sort of statement showing remorse for what he'd been planning to do. And then since he was sentenced when he was 18, he was sent straight to an adult prison after the court proceedings finished. Dad went to see him while he was still on remand because the magnitude of Theo's offenses meant he couldn't get bail. And he said he gave him some big speech about how he needed to cooperate as much as possible because he could end up ruining his entire life over one stupid mistake his younger self made. It sounded like Dad practically begged him to accept all the prosecution's offers regarding cooperation, but still, Theo refused to play ball. The solicitor said it was possible that the gang Theo believed he was a part of had promised all kinds of rewards for his loyalty, meaning if he kept his mouth shut and did his time, he'd be richly and lavishly rewarded once he got out. She told Dad that for the time being, Theo was probably being supported in prison by the gang's network, which was split between those in prison and those on the outside. It had given him the impression that he'd made the right decision and that the support would continue, whereas in reality, it had waned over time before disappearing completely. And after that, if Theo tried to leave and he had enough incriminating information in his head, he'd be killed. Dad tried telling him all that, but it was no good. Theo had made his mind up, and to the gang, loyalty was everything. And that was the last time he and Dad spoke. Mom's been to visit him a few times, and it never ends well. She cries when she gets back, and while me and Dad try our best to comfort her, it never seems to do any good. I've written to Theo a few times. Quite emotional stuff it's probably best I don't go into, but you can probably imagine what it consisted of. I've never heard back from him, and even if we do talk again in the future, it won't be with a Theo that I miss, the one who was my little brother and who always had the brightest of sparks about him, even if he was into some dark stuff. Now, I don't even know who he is anymore, and like I said, it's like my little brother just... disappeared. 'Disappeared. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights where I record the videos. I'd love to see you there. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all your future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, hot people are people too.
This was in October of 2022. I lived alone in a little home inside a small family-type neighborhood. I'd been there since 2015, and I saw the fall-off of Halloween firsthand. Basically, after 2020, nobody celebrated. None of the homes really put up any decorations, and none of the kids were interested in dressing up and going door to door for candy, which up until then was always a big thing that everyone did every year. The last 2 years, my neighborhood was just quiet and empty on Halloween night, so I really assumed this year would be all the same. On the morning of Halloween, I made coffee and went to sit out on the front porch to look at all the fall-colored trees. But as soon as I opened the door, there were these 2 kids in my front yard, maybe 30 feet away, standing where all the trees were. And I say kids, but I really couldn't tell for sure. I only assumed because they were wearing Halloween masks. They were on the taller side though, and skinny. Most likely high schoolers, if not adults. They were too far to get any sort of good look, and basically the instant I opened the door, both of them froze for a second, then hurriedly walked further into the trees and away from my home. It could not have looked more suspicious, the way they hurried off. It was the exact reaction you'd get from catching kids doing something that they shouldn't have been. And even though it was Halloween, I'd never seen anyone just wander around in masks in the morning. Honestly, I thought it was just some kids being stupid. I mean, with the holiday and everything. At least they walked away once they saw me, so I didn't feel like I had to worry. I sat outside and enjoyed the decent fall weather while I had my coffee for the morning. The rest of that day was really the same as any other day, up until 4 o'clock. This was about when trick-or-treaters would start walking around, although, like I said, I hadn't seen any in years. Still, I'm not too sure why, but I'd get a small bag of candy and have it ready in case a few kids did come around. I guess it was just the tradition of it that I was holding on to. I sat on the sofa in the living room and turned on whatever channel I could find that was playing all the typical Halloween shows and movies. I also left the curtains open by the front windows, so I could see outside if any kids were walking around. Over the next couple hours, I saw nothing more than a few cars driving down the street. No kids or anything walking around. And after a while, the sun went down and the whole street was just dark and lifeless. Even after all these years, it still felt weird seeing that on Halloween. I stayed in the living room and continued to watch TV. Around 8 though, a knock sounded at the front door. It made me jump up from the couch. I didn't see anyone outside the windows walking up to my house, and even if it were a few lone trick-or-treaters, I thought it was a bit late for anyone to still be out. I brought the bowl of candy over anyway, and opened the door. I felt a small shiver run through me when I saw it was the same 2 kids I'd seen earlier. Again, they had masks on, and full black clothing, so kids was just my guess. But up close, they were definitely a lot taller than what I'd expect from anyone still trick-or-treating. and I quickly noticed they didn't even have bags or anything to carry any candy with. The two of them just stood there. Couldn't even see either of their eyes through the masks, so it made it really strange for me. I still tried to smile and asked if they wanted candy, holding out the bowl. Neither of them spoke, and after just a couple seconds of waiting, I just closed the door, completely weirded out. But even after that second encounter with them, I still thought this was just some stupid Halloween joke that they were pulling on me, probably trying to scare me just to mess with me. I waited a minute, then looked out the door again, and the two were gone, which for some reason confirmed to me that this was some stupid prank that I didn't need to overthink. I went back to the couch, watching TV well into the night. Don't think I got up until 1 or 2 a.m. to go to bed. I shut everything off and headed upstairs. By this point, the two kids hadn't crossed my mind in hours. I hopped in bed and felt myself falling asleep within seconds, but was suddenly shot back awake by a knock echoing through the house. I quickly got up and opened the bedroom door. They knocked again, right at the front door, the sound resonating through all the quiet rooms and hallways of my home. I quietly walked downstairs, trying to see who it was. I was genuinely terrified, even though I was sure it was the same kids, because at this point, it was way more than just some harmless prank. This was stalking, or harassment at the very least. I went up to the door and looked out. There was only one of them. He stood there, mask over his face, right up to the door, still knocking repeatedly. But it was just him, and that sort of freaked me out. Where the hell was the other? I backed away from the door, trying to get myself to think straight. And then I heard a soft creak behind me. A door swaying open in the hallway. I shifted my body around. There was a shadowy figure at the end of the hall, and the moment I looked at him, he began barreling toward me, knife in hand. I sprinted up the stairs and into my bedroom, locking it and moving everything I could in front of it. I started calling the police while trying to think of what to do next. Outside the door, I could hear the muffled sound of the two guys talking back and forth. Couldn't tell what they were saying, but I think they were also debating what to do. And after 30 seconds, their footsteps moved back downstairs and out of the house. A few officers came over and did an investigation, but they didn't find much to go off of. We all agree, though, that one of them knocking at the front door was a distraction, so the other could find a way in and jump me. Why they targeted me is the biggest uncertainty, though, and it still has me terrified. A lot of people I talk to think it was a couple of deranged teens, or even young adults, that had some sick plan in mind to do on Halloween night. That would explain all of it happening to me for no real reason, but I don't think I'll ever get to know for sure. Behind my neighborhood is a decent-sized forest with plenty of trails for hiking and camping. I frequented a lot of them, but often found I enjoyed the experience way better when nobody else was around. I avoided all the major campgrounds and preferred to tent camp along some of the backpacking trails. I did this camping trip sometime near the end of autumn, as I remember all the trees were leafless, and it was starting to get colder outside with each passing day. I thought I'd be fine for at least 1 or 2 more trips before winter, though. I set out on a hike at midday. No cars or people were anywhere near the trailhead, and along the 8-mile hike, I didn't see anyone at all. I think most people were probably done for the hiking and camping season. It was quite a bit colder than I expected, but I came prepared with heavy jackets and a -20-degree sleeping bag, which was more than enough for what I was doing. Eventually, I came across an open spot that looked like a nice place to set up for the night. It was just a bit off the beaten trail, and I'm pretty sure I'd actually camped there once or twice before, so I felt comfortable as I got my tent up, built a small fire ring, and got a campfire going. I made a hot cup of decaf to help me warm up as I sat right next to the fire. With the sun going down, it started to get colder and colder. There was a bit of a breeze too, throwing cold wind in my face, and honestly making the experience more miserable than I was hoping for. And there was something else. I kept seeing something in the distance, like way out in the trees. It was far enough to blend in with everything, all the dry branches and bushes, so I didn't know what it was. But it was like whatever or whoever it was staying perfectly far enough to keep me from seeing them. Only their movement between all the trees was visible, and with the sun getting lower and lower, it only made me feel more uneasy. The feeling that I was being stalked was creeping into my head, but I tried to shut it down. I didn't want to believe that that was even a possibility. I really hoped it wasn't even a person at all, and was just a deer or harmless animal roaming around its territory. An hour after sundown, and with night overhead, the uneasy feeling mixed with the chilling cold winds made me really uncomfortable. I thought maybe fixing one of those problems would help, so I moved into the tent and inside my sleeping bag to warm up. I left the opening unzipped, with the flap tied to the top so I could still get a little bit of warmth from the campfire, and watch the flames as I laid inside. It definitely helped me stay warm, but only being able to see what was directly in front of me wasn't all that great. Plus, beyond maybe 10 feet of the campfire, it was just complete blackout. I want to say too that I'd been camping for years, so this feeling of being alone in the woods at night wasn't unfamiliar, and yet this was the only time I'd ever felt this way. Everyone always says when you get a bad sense or feel something is off, you should just pack up and leave without questioning it. I was naive enough to think I'd never get that feeling, and even worse, I was stupid not to listen to it. I stayed in the tent, curled up in my sleeping bag and watching the fire. A good 2 or 3 hours went by. Nothing really changed, except it got colder. But as I laid there, I started to hear what sounded like cracking footsteps across the woods. It was coming from behind my tent, the one area I couldn't see at all. I wanted to get up and look, but I sort of froze up, the panic setting in as I let my mind try to think of every possible way that what I was hearing was something other than what it was. The footsteps crept closer and closer, getting maybe 5 to 10 feet away from the back of the tent, before it suddenly went quiet. The crunching stopped, and the sounds of the campfire and wind blowing through the woods filled the void. My heart was pounding in my chest. Embarrassingly, I think I stayed frozen in place for a whole minute before the pain and anxiety of knowing someone was right behind my tent became too much to bear. In one swift motion, I unzipped my sleeping bag, grabbed my flashlight, and jumped out of the tent, shining the light directly at the woods behind me. Nothing. No one was there. Somehow, this actually made me panic even more. I never heard any footsteps walking away, so honestly, a part of me thought I was going crazy. I must have stood there swiveling around and shining the flashlight in every direction for 15 minutes, listening to every sound the woods made, and being completely indecisive about what to do, whether to pack and try to run out of the forest in the dark, or camp it out and just keep watch. I was freezing though, and the fire was running low on fuel. After a while, I decided to pack. Wasn't sure yet if I'd leave or stay around the campsite, but packing seemed like a good idea either way. As soon as I began taking down my tent, a flurry of footsteps moved from the dark area just behind it. I thought I might have seen a bit of them running away too, but with the flickering campfire casting shadows on everything, I couldn't say for sure. I quickly packed up, stopping every few seconds to look around. I was completely paranoid. After a few minutes, I managed to get everything stuffed into my bag. I tossed it over my shoulders, and before I could stomp out the fire, a man appeared across from me. He walked up quickly, approaching the light. He was on the taller and larger side, with some torn up jeans and a dirty fleece jacket, and a black beanie on his head. He looked around 40 and had heavy, distant eyes. "Leaving so late. Way too cold to be running out into the dark like that." He spoke in a gravelly, firm voice. I didn't even respond, taking a few steps back. The man looked like he was trying to figure out how to keep me there. But once I started to get further away, I could see in his face that he realized he wasn't in control. His eyes grew into this unsettling stare. I turned and just started running, straight into the trees. Could barely see where I was going, but I could hear the man's footsteps coming up behind me. After about 30 seconds though, I'd either run too far for him to follow, or he just stopped chasing. I still ran for 15 more minutes, just to be safe and get as much distance as possible. But then I was lost. It was pitch black, and there was no way for me to know which way would take me back to the trail. And even if I went the right way, I'd probably not be able to see the trail in the dark. So I sat up against a tree in the middle of the darkness and just waited. Hours passed as I sat there shivering. The whole forest was silent and still pitch black. I swear though, a couple of times I heard something moving in the distance, out in the trees, like the guy was walking around looking for me still. I just remained quiet and waited for the sun to come up, allowing me to see where I was and make my way back. I made it out unharmed, which I honestly think is a miracle. I think that guy had some really nasty intentions that I narrowly escaped from. He'd likely been stalking me all night, waiting for a moment to do something. Why it all unfolded the way it did, I don't know. Last fall, my sister went on a trip over Halloween weekend. It was for some sort of party she was going to, but she was flying there, so taking her dog Milo wasn't really that convenient. She'd be gone for only a couple days though, and I offered to watch Milo while she was away. The apartment I lived in didn't allow pets, so rather than bringing Milo to my place, I just stayed at her house for the weekend. I packed my work laptop and some other random things I might need, then headed 30 minutes down to the house in the morning. Just an hour after arriving, my sister left for her trip. Now, Milo was a really easy dog to look after. I'd done this a bunch of times before. He was super sweet and wasn't all that loud either, despite being a German Shepherd. He was getting older, so most of the time he just hung out in whatever room I was in and relaxed while I worked. So I set my laptop up in one of the spare bedrooms and started my workday. Milo laid in his doggy bed right next to my desk, just out of the corner of my view. There wasn't much going on for several hours, aside from me working. But oddly, throughout the day, he kept perking his head up. Usually I'd assume it was just a dog being a dog, hearing something small that was really nothing. But this was different. He was sure he'd actually heard something, because he wouldn't just go right back to sleep. Milo's head would raise and his ears would perk up, and he'd stare at the doorway for a whole 5 to 10 minutes. It happened enough for me to get up at one point and look around the house. Milo followed me as I did. He stayed right by my side, focused, like he was also searching for something. I never found or saw anything, but it definitely gave me an off feeling. I think I finished working around 5 or 6. Being fall, we had about an hour before it got dark and cold, so I hooked Milo up to his leash and took him out behind the house on a walk. My sister got lucky with this place, basically having a forest-preserved trail right behind it. But this time of year, all the trees along the path were already stripped of leaves, and basically just dead looking. It actually made it feel a bit spooky, with it being later in the afternoon. It was also really quiet out there, just me and Milo walking, crunching all the dry leaves on the trail. I knew the trail was about a 20-minute loop, and we went down just about halfway, when suddenly Milo stopped. Like, just completely stopped in place. I looked at him, asking if he was okay, and tugging on the leash, but he wouldn't budge. He wouldn't even look at me. His eyes were fixed on something ahead of me. I turned and looked down the trail, but I didn't see anything. I looked back down at Milo and pet him, then gently tugged the leash forward again, but he still wouldn't move, and his gaze was still fixed at something down at the end of the trail, further in the forest. So I just turned and began heading back. Milo then immediately followed. The rest of the walk to the house, he kept looking back, but never once stopped to sniff or anything. He just kept his tail down and followed next to me all the way back to the house. It made me feel really nervous, seeing him being nervous. I wasn't so sure though whether it was him I was nervous about, or about whatever he was so scared of. I ended up calling my sister and talking to her for a bit after getting back inside, asking if she might know why he was acting like this, but she had no clue. Even throughout that phone call, Milo was attached to my side. It made me feel unsettled or uneasy, like he was aware of something that I wasn't. I started walking the house again as I thought about it, and casually looked out a few of the windows, but it wasn't until I got back upstairs to the spare bedroom that I looked out that window and saw something weird. It was just for a moment, but I thought I saw someone out there. Right near the house, someone walking from left to right, disappearing past the edge of the window before I could get a good look. It was almost like when you see something in the corner of your eye, and you think you know what you saw, but when you look, you realize it was nothing. So I couldn't say whether what I saw was real, or just my mind playing tricks because I was so unsettled. I stayed up in that room, sitting at the desk and trying to take it easy for the rest of the night. I watched some videos on my laptop and kept an eye on Milo. He stayed quiet, laying near me and seeming exhausted from the day. For the next 2 or so hours we were up there, nothing much happened. Milo was passed out, and I was just watching YouTube and trying to relax. Even with all the strangeness going on, I was able to sort of separate my mind from it. Not that I totally forgot about it all, but I guess I thought it just wasn't anything serious. Once it was late, I started getting ready for bed and brought Milo downstairs to let him outside one more time. I opened the back door and flicked on the lights. Milo was hesitant, but still went out. As he did his business, I looked around. The woods around the house were quiet and eerie. I watched Milo walk toward the trees, then stop and turn. Not to face me, but he was staring at something at the side of the house. I peered around the doorway and looked. Within seconds, all I saw was a man charging toward me. I jumped back and Milo started sprinting at him. The guy looked horrified for a second, stopping dead in his tracks and trying to dodge the dog. I thought Milo was actually about to attack the guy for a moment, but at the last second, he backed off and started barking and growling while listening to my voice and running back inside. I closed the door and locked it, and before I could see anything else, the guy was gone. Just like that, in a matter of seconds, everything was quiet again. I quickly called 911. To be fully honest though, the cops were no help at all. They shined their lights around, but that was about it. However, as we were talking about what had happened, I was playing around with the door and happened to find that the lock on the back door actually didn't work. The lever would click and everything, but it would still open. My sister was sure it was never like that before. That night, I took Milo to a hotel, and we spent the next day there. Based on Milo's behavior, I think the guy was probably watching us all day, and even following us out in the woods on our walk. But also, there's a chance he had been inside the home before, maybe even during the day while I was working. I keep thinking back to how Milo was constantly looking at the doorway, and the lock on the back door not working seems to be a really big coincidence. But Milo definitely startled him, enough to get us both inside safely and scare him away. I'm actually quite surprised though, because my sister hasn't had anything weird happen, or any encounters since then. It almost makes me think that the man wasn't there for her. Maybe he'd been watching me for longer than I knew, and found out I'd be alone at a house in the woods, rather than safely up in my apartment building with other people around. And so he thought it'd be his best chance to do whatever he was trying to do. Probably something horrible. Can't say for sure, but I've been on edge ever since.
For the past 30 years or so, I've been driving around eastern Kentucky and the western Virginias and conducting interviews with everyday people. The goal is to someday publish a book entitled A Secret History of Appalachia, comprising all the more fascinating but more importantly mysterious stories that I've recorded along the way. I'm talking about the stuff that didn't end up in any newspaper or book, but stayed in the mouths, ears, and minds of people that either experienced them or still tell the tales. People have told me about murders they've seen, or the ones they've claimed to have committed, and I've also heard about daring escapes from abusive marriages, people vanishing in the woods, and more fatal mining accidents than I care to remember. Most are what I like to call ordinary tragedies, and by that I mean they're things that many of us have either experienced or can relate to. But then there are a handful of stories I describe as extraordinary, the ones that still spring fresh to mind all this time later, and that don't have much in the way of rational explanation. Which brings me to a visit that I made to Perry County, Kentucky in the fall of 1997. Perry County sits right at the heart of Appalachian Kentucky, and the first thing I noticed was how wild some of the place names were. There's a little hamlet up north called Rowdy, a town called Hazard, and one called Viper. There's even a town called Krypton, but it's named after the nearby gas deposits, not Superman. But it was while walking down Baker Street in a little place called Combs that an old man sitting on his red-painted porch croaked up, "You lost." When I told him I was right where I wanted to be, he gave me a confused look and asked, "What's that supposed to mean?" I explained the whole reason I traveled to places like Combs was to talk to people like him, and then I told him about the book and all of that, and his eldest son walked out onto the porch to join us. When I gave the son the Cliff Notes version, he pointed to his paw and told me that he had enough stories to fill a book and then some. Because the old man I'd encountered, up until the age of about 30 when he met his wife, used to be a bona fide outlaw who'd been in and out of prison for various acts of armed robbery. I'd have happily listened to every story that old outlaw had to offer me, but I know folks got better things to do than to sit and yap with a nosy old so-and-so like me. And so what I tend to do is ask them to tell the one story that means the most to them, or the one that they think America really ought to know about. The younger of the two suggested to his dad to tell me the wrong truck story from after he got back from the war. Lemuel, or Lem for short, must have been in his mid to late 70s, but while his mind was still pretty sharp, his storytelling abilities weren't quite what they used to be, so he asked his son to tell me the story instead. And so it all starts when Lemuel returned from France after serving in the infantry during the war. It's a widely accepted myth that the soldiers who came back from Europe slipped seamlessly back into their old lives. And while it's true that a lot of veterans come back with a profound peace and a greater appreciation of life, that's not true for all. Lem was just 20 years old when he fought the Germans in North Africa. And then when the job was done, he fought them in Italy, then France, and then finally Germany, until that son of a bitch running Germany took the coward's way out. And the war in Europe was finished, and a few months later, the war in the Pacific was done too. But the war in Lem's mind wasn't even close to being finished. Thanks to the GI Bill passed in 1944, Lem was entitled to receive a free college education, all paid for on the taxpayer's dime. He enrolled in an engineering course in 1947, but was thrown out in only his second semester after socking one of his professors right in the mouth. Apparently, this professor had a thing or two to say about what happened over there in Europe, things old Lem didn't take too kindly to. Having sworn off college as places people are taught to be stupid, Lem got himself a job at a mechanic's shop in Hazard, and that's how he got his hands on his very own motorcycle. He'd ridden a Harley Liberator while he was over in Europe, not in a professional capacity, mind you, just for fun. But boy, was it fun. So much fun that when he and his boss had a bashed-up S125 come into the shop, Lem didn't offer to fix it. He straight up offered to buy it. And that's how by the summer of 1949, Lem had joined a motorcycle club based down in Harlan. And while they didn't have flaming skulls on their leather or a name like Satan's Hamsters, their collective addiction to adrenaline started to have a greater and greater influence over time. Eastern Kentucky's always been a poor place. Even when it was the economic backbone of the region, it was the mining executives who took home the biggest slice of pie, while leaving the miners themselves to fight it out over the crumbs. A lot of vets didn't mind, especially the ones who didn't have the smarts for college, because pulling coal out of the ground sure as hell beats getting shot at, but not everyone saw it that way. Lem and his buddies at the club hadn't helped liberate Europe just to come back home and break their backs down there in the dark. No, if they weren't going to be given what they deserved by helping save the whole damn world, they were going to take it. At least that's what they told themselves, so they could go back to doing not so much what they wanted, but were conditioned to do: find the enemy and defeat them. And to me, the group's attitude is best summed up by their leader, a man by the name of Johnny Gordon. According to Lem, Johnny was the great-great-great-grandson of his namesake John Gordon, who was simultaneously a pioneer, planter, trader, and soldier. And it wasn't hard to believe that Johnny had the same blood in him. He was the president of the motorcycle club, a full-time engine mechanic, and a fine banjo player. Not to mention an excellent brewer of homemade wine who knew how to grow, harvest, and process his own tobacco. But back during the war, Johnny had fought the Japanese in the Pacific, not as a regular soldier, but as a Marine raider. The rest of the boys would go from island to island, storming beaches, capturing airfields, and clearing the Japanese out of their bunkers. But Johnny and his boys had a very difficult job. Before the main body of troops invaded an island, the Marines would send in the raiders at night to cause chaos and inflict casualties. And while the regular guys fought with discipline, obeying the laws of war and following a strict chain of command, the raiders fought like savages. They slipped into Japanese encampments late at night, cutting sentries' throats before tossing whole bundles of hand grenades into the places they slept. Two of their favorite things were killing officers and blowing up big guns. But the thing they loved the most was taking scalps. I don't mean literally, of course. That would have gotten them into a whole ton of trouble. But the raiders loved taking home flags, weapons like those samurai swords, or even just pieces of Japanese uniform to show off how close they'd gotten to them without picking up so much as a scratch. And that's all Johnny did for years and years, hit-and-run attacks in the dead of night before running back to the boats, sometimes carrying 2 whole armfuls of loot. And while not many would actually say it out loud, folks like Johnny Gordon actually missed the war, and he wasn't the only one. So when Johnny wanted to put together a posse, one that'd halt and rob trucks that came through Perry County at night, he was surprised to find that half the club wanted in on it, Lemmy included. Now, after enlisting the help of some scouts over in Laurel County, where there was a big old truck stop the long haulers used to visit, the first truck Johnny and Lem ran down was wall-to-wall cigarettes. They pulled up alongside the cab on their bikes and fired a sawed-off shotgun into the air to get the driver's attention. And then they'd fill up the bed of a truck driven by one of their guys, then tear off down the road and onto the back roads before the cops even heard that there had been a robbery. They sold what they stole on the black market, split the take equally between whoever was on the job, and then waited for the next piece of intel to come in, telling them when and where to be. And that's how they stayed sane, I guess. Uncle Sam had turned them into men who needed a war to fight, so when they got home to Perry, they waged one of their very own, where the spoils were theirs to keep. Johnny and the boys kept up their truck robberies for literally years in the Appalachian area, despite both the cops trying to find them and the truck companies trying to avoid them, and it was all because of what Johnny learned in the Raiders. They'd strike in seemingly random places so they weren't at all predictable, but more importantly, they never got too greedy either. Raiding was essentially a game of risk management. Wherever they were at their lowest, that's where you were going to hit. Through sticking to that same raider doctrine that he'd been taught, Johnny and his boys were successful time and time again, and according to Lem's son, they made a heck of a lot of money from it too. They hit cigarette trucks, liquor trucks, trucks hauling fine leathers or ladies' dresses. Anything they could get a decent resale value on, they'd steal it. And they even hit a wagon with an armed escort that had been hauling silver across the country. But after that, the company never sent a truck through eastern Kentucky ever again. They had themselves a good old time in that first year or so, but after a while, the prey started to thin out. Some trucking companies changed their times and routes so nothing ever went out at night, and if it did, they sure as hell didn't pass through Perry County. Johnny and his boys started making less and less money, and at one point, it looked like they'd be forced to hang up their gloves, as it were. But then came the call that changed everything for them, when the scouts over in Laurel heard a rumor about a heavily guarded convoy that was set to pass through Perry County that night. The scouts said the convoy consisted of 3 vehicles. One vehicle coming up the rear with its passengers openly carrying shotguns, followed by a large truck so clumsy and slow-looking that it just had to be armored-plated on the sides. Then up front was a flatbed, again containing armed passengers, only this one had a manned machine gun turret set up in the back. No, they weren't traveling across the whole country like that, just eastern Kentucky, and all thanks to the work Johnny and his boys had been doing. And all that armed security had to mean one thing. Whatever they were hauling, it had to be worth 5, maybe even 6 figures at resale. Johnny was dead set on hitting that truck, and he didn't care if they had to kill to get at what it was hauling. It was like the good Lord himself had placed their final job right there in front of them, so they could retire and quit while they were still ahead. But not all the raiders agreed with him. Some suggested it was a trap, one the trucking companies were counting on the raiders taking the bait on. But Johnny said that there was no way in hell that they'd outfit a truck with such expensive protection unless they really didn't want them getting their hands on it. And folks were also asking why the hell they'd send a convoy through Perry County at night. But to Johnny, it was a question of speed. Whoever wanted those goods transported wanted them moved fast, and that meant no detours. Besides, the moment Johnny heard about those armed guards, he didn't just see it as a job anymore. He saw it as a challenge. Johnny managed to convince 5 of his boys to ride with him that night, Lem included. But their usual plan was just far too risky given the circumstances. He sent one of his boys out on this bike to act as a lookout, and then once he was sure the convoy was on its way down, Johnny put the first phase of his plan into action. Sometime later, when the armed convoy was within just a few miles of Hazard, the lead vehicle spotted 2 big fires burning in the darkness ahead of them. Then when they got closer, they found 2 burning cars and a man claiming to be from the Perry County Sheriff's Department. The deputy, who was in fact one of Johnny's boys carrying a fake badge, directed them down Couchtown Road, claiming if they followed it, it'd take them right into Hazard and back onto the highway. The men in the lead vehicle seemed a little on edge, but they also had a schedule to keep, so they thanked the deputy for his directions and then turned off onto Couchtown. But rather than lead them into Hazard, the road led them towards nothing but an ambush. Johnny opened up on the lead vehicle with an old bar, and on the fast fire setting too, not the slower one, and the driver either panicked or was killed instantly because it jerked to the side before flipping over and blocking the road. Lem said the machine gunner was killed instantly as he was thrown from the back of the truck, having never even fired a shot. The cargo truck smashed into the upturned vehicle in front, I guess from where the driver wanted to just get out of the ambush zone, but all it did was stop the truck, not clear the way. Lem and the boys then rushed out of the dark trees at the side of the road and took the occupants of the 3rd vehicle prisoner without any bloodshed. Out of 11 guys, Johnny and his boys only killed 3 members of that convoy to get what they wanted. The rest of them had their weapons taken away before they were forced to lie down in the dirt with their hands on the back of their heads. Sporting the cloth mask and hat Johnny wore during robberies, he walked up and down the line of disarmed men, asking who the driver was and what was in the truck. Even way back then, professional truck drivers needed to know what they were hauling. It was even written into law. So when the driver claimed not to know, Johnny didn't believe him. He didn't need any keys or codes or anything. Lem and the boys were in the process of breaking into the cargo box regardless. He was just curious what all the security was for. And so when the driver claimed not to know what was in the back, he figured they were in for the score of a lifetime, just like he'd predicted. Lem told me himself that he thought that they'd be greeted by a wall of gold bars when they popped that can open, because it took them a whole 20 minutes to cut through all the locks and bolts sealing it shut. Then when they clipped off the last one, and the doors stood ready to be heaved open, Johnny said he wanted the honor of being the first one inside. Maybe there was a little part of Johnny that believed it was a trap, on account of the driver not knowing what was inside. He didn't want to tell someone else to open the doors only for them to be greeted by a second machine gun and a hail of bullets. So instead of ordering the doors open, Johnny told Lem to hold his horses, then walked up to the doors himself. Lem said when Johnny pulled open the doors, it was dark inside. He had nothing but a weak flashlight to light it up. So to get a closer look at what they'd captured, he climbed up inside the cargo box alone. Lem said he and his boys were just itching to know what was inside, and even the prisoners lying there in the dirt were looking up to get a glimpse of what they'd been hauling. But when Johnny was done looking around and found what he'd been searching for, the whole atmosphere changed. He called out for a crowbar at one point and would be heard cursing as he rifled through what sounded like boxes of straw after popping their lids off with the crowbar. Then suddenly, everything went quiet, and when Johnny spoke next, that's when everything changed. A guy named Tommy called out to him asking what he'd found, but Johnny only replied, "Don't come in here, Tommy. It's not what we thought." Lem said he walked towards the open door and had one hand on the box's floor when Johnny told him that if he climbed into the box, he'd shoot him dead. He sounded serious too, deadly serious, and not like a greedy kind of serious either, more like terrified. Lem said Johnny hopped out of the box a second later, carrying what looked to be a wooden box under his arm. It looked expensive, so whatever was inside, it had to be expensive too, but then Tommy demanded to see what was inside. Johnny had a pistol on him before he could so much as take a single step forward. Johnny swore that he'd give each one of them $500 the very next day if they just stopped asking questions and let him leave with the box. But Lem said that just for a moment there, it seemed like his boys weren't going to allow it. I can sympathize with him too in a way. The arrangement had been the same for years on end, and now they had this big score land in their lap, and the one they all thought that they could retire on, and Johnny suddenly wanted to keep it all for himself. Lem said Johnny had to swear on his mama's life that he'd already looked inside and that they didn't want no part of what was in that box. He'd never lied to them before, and he wasn't about to start then, and then he swore that as the years went by, they'd come to thank him for not showing them, not curse him for it. Lem said he remembered the heavy silence that hung in the air as the boys made up their minds, and then, one by one, he and the boys agreed to take the $500, rather than even see what was in Johnny's mystery box. Lem said they trusted Johnny with their lives, so while anyone else might have had a mutiny on their hands, Johnny's boys were willing to take him at his word and agreed to take the cash instead. Before they cut their prisoners loose, they torched all 3 vehicles. And then as they shot up their gas tanks and put their lighters to the fluid, Lem said he asked Johnny to level with him and tell him what was inside. In reply, Johnny gave the only clue he ever issued when he said, "Something that won't burn." And after that, they made sure their prisoners stayed face down in the dirt during their departure, and then they ran off to where their bikes were stashed and went their separate ways. Lem said that was the usual agreement, split up and lay low. But rather than keep up appearances at his day job and sitting on the loot until the heat had died down, Johnny stayed true to his word. He paid each man $500 in cash for their services that previous night, and he also took that fancy-looking box on a little journey up into the hills, where he buried it someplace a pastor had told him to. At least, that's what he told Lem when they talked about it just the one time. He said it was about 2 weeks later after he stopped by Johnny's place to see how he and his family were doing. Johnny said he was doing fine and his wife and kids seemed well enough, but the man himself didn't look so hot. He said he'd been feeling under the weather ever since the job, but that all he needed was a little rest and he'd be right as rain again. But that's when Lem asked what he did with the box and what was inside. And Johnny said he didn't really know what was in that box, but that whatever it was appeared small and withered and dark, almost like a half-rotten yarn or something. Another man might be confused why such an item might require such secure transportation, but Johnny didn't need to ask. Just laying eyes on it filled him with this terrible sense of dread, and from the moment he opened the box until the moment he closed it, he felt this strange sensation of cold nausea run through him, almost like it was poisonous or toxic somehow. Johnny made the decision to take it before he even knew what he was going to do with it. All he could be certain of was that he didn't want it getting anywhere near his boys. I guess if this story had taken place in some other area of the country, Johnny might have taken the box to a university to have scientists run tests on it or something. But over there in eastern Kentucky, his first thought was to take it to a man of God, to ask his opinion on it. Johnny said he took the box to the church his mama used to pray at, and then showed it to the pastor there after explaining what had happened. He said he'd been scared the pastor was going to tell him to return it, and then confessed what he'd done to the county sheriff. Only, he didn't. Instead, the pastor tells him to take the box to this one particular spot in the hills. It had to be this one place, nowhere else. Then when he got there, he was to dig a hole, deep as he would a grave, before burying the box down there in the rocky mountain soil. Johnny said that he did just as the pastor told him and dug a hole so deep his back ached by the time he saw it was good and finished. But as he walked back to his truck, he realized he felt that same cold sickness he felt back in the cargo box that previous night. He told Lem that he figured it was some kind of secret government thing that they'd stumbled across, like some sort of ingredient for a secret weapon, like the one they used on the Japanese to get them to surrender finally. But he could never know for sure, and I guess all the pastor had tried to do was either keep his ass out of jail, because he sure as heck didn't know what it was either. Lem said they never did figure out what they stole, but he knows what it did, and what it did was kill his friend. Johnny never stopped feeling under the weather after that night robbing the truck. In fact, he got worse and worse and skinnier over the course of about 2 years before he finally slipped away during the night. The doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. They ran all kinds of tests and sent him to see all kinds of specialists to see if it was the cancer getting to him. But no one could work out what the problem was. All they said was that the symptoms suggested some kind of wasting disease, but one they couldn't even slow the effects of, let alone cure. Lem said the whole motorcycle club showed up to see Johnny off, but that 2 funerals took place that day, Johnny's and the club's. The club died with him and ended up sharing his grave, but Lem never forgot about the job that killed his old buddy Johnny, and he was willing to bet no one else had either, if they're still breathing, that is. And you know something? Johnny's is a story I don't think I'll be forgetting anytime soon either, because it's one that deals with a subject I hear addressed often, a story of a flawed man, but one whose heart was always in the right place. On a remote pig farm in Canada, life seemed to move at its own strange pace. The property became known for late-night gatherings, wandering rumors, and a sense that something was not quite right. As the years passed, whispers grew louder, drawing attention to the isolated farm and its owner, Robert Picton. What emerged from the mud and silence would become one of the darkest mysteries in Canadian criminal history. Listen to the full story over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, linked down below. Long ago, at the dawn of the 1990s, in the days that I could still walk upstairs without my damn knees aching, my buddies and I used to be quite the outdoorsmen. We all met after joining the outing club at Dartmouth, which is basically the fancy old-timey name for hiking and camping club. And then after graduation, when one of us went back to school down at West Virginia University, the Appalachian Trail called out to us. We decided on a place called Dolly Sods, and while that might sound like the drag name of an old British man, it's actually the name of a wilderness area about 3 hours' drive from Morgantown. We figured we'd start at the Bear Rocks trailhead, and then we'd camp at the creek, and then complete the loop on our second day via Big Stone Coal. It'd give us plenty of leeway to check places at our leisure, and that while it'd be a challenge, it'd still be enjoyable and not just a pure grind. But what none of us realized when we went off on that day was that none of us would be making it to the campsite that evening. So on that first day, we were walking along the trail after being on the move all day when I started falling behind because nature was calling. I told the guys to keep going and that I'd catch up to them in no time, and then I ducked off into the bushes to do my thing. Now, this wasn't a quick stop either. It was very much a pants-down situation, and I don't know about you guys, but it always takes me a minute or two out in the woods because I have a very irrational fear of a bobcat jumping up my butt and running off with my spleen, or maybe a spider crawling up my poop. Now, thankfully, I was able to take care of business before I saw him, but literally just as I'm finishing up, I see this dude walk out from behind a tree off in the distance. He was wearing a red bandana or something that was covering most of his face, and a long coat that looked way too heavy for how hot the weather was. But what put the fear of God into me was when I saw him dragging a limp human body into view behind him. He was dragging another person, who was either dead or unconscious. I couldn't tell, and he was dragging him like it was nothing. People are heavy. Like, have you ever tried carrying someone? You can't just drag a grown-ass man along the forest floor like that, not unless you have goddamn super strength or something. And so the second I saw them, I dropped the asswipe, pulled my pants up, and then crept back towards the trail as quickly and quietly as I could. I didn't think he'd spotted me. He certainly didn't call out or anything, but my adrenaline was spiking by the time I caught up with my friends. I spared no detail, and after only briefly asking if I was pranking them or not, they took me at my word and we started moving as fast as we could down the trail. We couldn't run with our packs, obviously, not for any sustained period, so we ended up basically power walking down the trail while trying to figure out which of the upcoming trailheads would take us to town and to some kind of sheriff's department that I could file a report at. But before long, the sun started dropping and we realized that we weren't going to make it to any kind of civilization before dark. Realizing we had little choice, we kept going through the night, headlamps on with long sticks in hand, while we jumped at every snap of a twig or rustle of a bush. We were convinced someone was about to jump us, but thankfully it didn't look like anyone was following us. The exhaustion started to hit really hard around 1 a.m, and if it wasn't for all that adrenaline, I just know that I'd have tapped out around then. But just talking about what I saw or speculating on what it was, and suddenly I didn't feel so tired anymore. Finally, as the sky starts lightening up, we hit a trailhead that spits us out near the small town. We were dead on our feet, with legs like jelly, and we were covered in sweat and dirt, so we found a spot just off the trail to collapse for a quick breather before we made our way into the town. Now the sun was barely up, and the birds had just started chirping, and for a second there, it felt like maybe we overreacted, and that everything was going to be just fine. But then suddenly, my buddy Josh points back towards the trail and says, "You all see that, right?" And we all look over to where he's pointing, and there, we see this thin line running between the two trees. It was a tripwire, a no-joke tripwire right there where we were about to walk. And that's when the fear really kicked in. We didn't touch it or go near it. We just backed away slowly, convinced that someone had set it up for us, or people like us. We ditched the main path and started cutting through the woods with no real plan except putting distance between us and whatever was waiting for us if we triggered that trap. And that's when my friend notices someone moving parallel to us through the trees. Not close enough to make out details about him, like that red face cover, but he was definitely shadowing us. He'd stop when we stopped, shifted when we shifted, and it wasn't some random hiker either. There was no way. And then once we were all in agreement to run, I gave a signal, and we went running through the woods together as fast as we could. Luckily, we were way closer to town by that point, so it was only maybe 5 or 10 minutes of sprinting before we broke through the trees and spotted the trailhead. And then about after 20 minutes of power walking and looking over our shoulders, we walked into town, found the sheriff's office, and told a deputy about the entire story. From the body, to the tripwire, to the guy who seemed to be stalking us when we walked off the trail. In all fairness, they took the report very seriously, and the sheriff sent a deputy out to check the areas that we mentioned. But on our way out of town, we get a call saying that there are no signs of any struggle, no tripwires or suspicious drag marks, nothing like that at all. We could tell the deputies went from taking us seriously to thinking that we were just a bunch of city kids who'd gotten our panties in a twist, probably after seeing some perfectly normal, albeit illegal, hunting activity. But that's not what I saw, man. Not by a long shot. We didn't go back, and we never planned to either. That whole stretch just left a bad taste, like we stumbled onto something we weren't supposed to see and barely got out unharmed. Part of me still wonders what the hell I saw out there, and if you're ever out on the Appalachian Trail and those remote spots that feel a little too isolated, keep your eyes open, because it can get really dangerous out there where there's no one else around. So my name's Brace, and I work in the safety department of a mining company here in West Virginia. That means I talk to a lot of veteran miners and union guys, and if there's one thing that they like to do, it's tell stories from their times in the trenches. And this is from McDowell County, way down south near where the Virginias meet Kentucky. McDowell was basically built on coal, and back in the day, it was one of the top producers in the entire country. Right now, the county's population is around 17,000. Way back when, almost 100,000 people called it home. Almost 3/4 of them belonged to mining families. Wages were some of the best in the industry. In West Virginia, coal fed mills and powered plants all over the nation. Whole towns became dependent on the mines to put food on their tables, but that meant as the government started shifting away from coal and towards things like nuclear and renewables, it hit Appalachia coal miners hard. People either moved out or found work in other industries. But some families, including mine, have deep, deep roots in the mines of McDowell County and weren't so quick to up and leave. And that's how so many stories accumulated, I guess, being passed down from one generation to another, and out of all the ones I've heard, this one probably makes the best campfire tale in terms of the sheer chill factor. So one day, I'm visiting Ekman on something fairly routine when this old foreman asked if I'd heard about the guy who tried to blow up mine number 44 back in the 70s. Turns out, I had heard the story before, or at least a version of it, about a guy who got trapped in a tunnel in a nearby mine after a collapse. Now, I was told his buddies didn't even realize he was missing for a whole day. Then when they got back to him, they messed up the excavation too, leaving him down there for almost a whole extra day before they finally got him out. According to the version I was told, the guy was so mad that when he came back to work, he stole a bunch of ANFO, a kind of explosive gel that you can pour into blast holes, and tried to take revenge by blowing up the mine and burying everyone on shift alive. Someone stopped him, worked out what he was trying to do, and he ended up getting shot by a guard before he could blow the mine, and himself sky high. But according to the old-timer I was working with that day, that's not how it happened. And then over coffee and some pepperoni rolls, this is what he told me. Sometime back in '73, 30 miners were working the longwall face deep in mine number 44 when a deep groan suddenly rumbled through the mountain. Then before they knew it, a massive roof fall of slate and rock completely sealed the main entry, trapping them behind a wall of debris. A rescue operation started immediately, and for the next 30 hours or so, the men rigged brattice cloth for ventilation, rationed what little water they had, and waited in the light of their battery lamps while rescue crews worked to free them. And finally, after more than an entire day's worth of excavating, the rescue teams broke through with their heavy machinery and brought the whole terrible thing to an end. Or so they thought. Everyone assumed the count was complete, but before people could start celebrating, they realized a miner named Bobby Ray Miller was still unaccounted for. He'd been working the tail end when the fall hit, meaning that he was trapped somewhere behind a second layer of debris without anybody hearing his weak cries for help. Rescue teams returned to the mine and got to work digging right away. But in their rush to rescue the trapped miner, they triggered a fresh collapse, which not only set the operation back by something like 22 hours, but might have killed the very person they were trying to save. After hastily re-timbering the passage and clearing the new fall, the rescue crews finally reached Bobby Ray on the second night. They found him in a small pocket, suffering from a head wound, cracked ribs, severe dehydration, and near-fatal carbon monoxide exposure. After hauling him onto a stretcher, they carried him into the moonlight outside. He was alive, but barely, and he spent weeks in the hospital for what was a slow and painful recovery. At first, he drifted in and out of consciousness as the doctors monitored him closely for black lung complications and possible brain swelling. And then when he was strong enough to be discharged, that's when the physical therapy started. Bobby Ray had to learn to walk all over again, and then he spent about a month at home regaining all of his strength. But even after his recovery was deemed to be complete, Simple tasks left him exhausted and his memory stayed patchy. The company's policy was that whenever a miner was injured on the job, there was always an open invitation to return to employment. But the reason the company was so generous was because few took them up on the offer. Spend 3 days trapped down in the dark where, with each passing second, you can feel yourself slowly fixing to die, and you're not so keen to jump right back down there. And men refused to return to work after going through way less than Bobby Ray did. Some believe their luck had just sort of run out and it was time to move on. And so you can imagine everyone's surprise when Bobby Ray suddenly announced that he was returning to work with immediate effect. It wasn't just his return that surprised people either, because the man who'd only just been on death's door wasn't just back at work, he was now volunteering for extra shifts. His fellow miners were happy for him at first and admired his go-get-em attitude. But it wasn't long before their happiness and admiration turned to unease, because the Bobby Ray who showed back up to work was different. The old Bobby had been a talker, and quick with a joke too, but when he came back, he was uncharacteristically cautious and quiet, to the point that he'd hesitate when it came to tasks that he'd once handled with ease. Bobby had to relearn what all considered to be the most basic of mining procedures, and he even had to relearn the layout of entries along with the names of longtime coworkers that he'd known for literally years. It was as if Bobby Ray had come back, but there was someone else at the wheel. As you can imagine, there was a lot of talk about him in the union halls and company houses, as it seemed like every shift that he worked, Bobby would say or do something that'd freak somebody out. Some blamed his behavior on prolonged exposure to bad air and said that prolonged exposure to gases like carbon monoxide might have damaged his brain and altered his personality for good. Others said that what broke him were the endless days and nights lying alone in darkness, while thinking that he'd been abandoned. Now, there was also the head injury to factor into things, as it's pretty well documented that people who suffer CTE can undergo radical personality changes. But whatever the cause was, everyone agreed that Bobby Ray came back different, and that the old one might never come back at all. I was told that while everyone was concerned for him, everyone felt really bad for him too. He wasn't even half the worker he used to be, but no one poked or prodded him too hard about it. Folks just let him be with the obvious expectations, tried to let him find his bearings again on his own. But that only had the opposite effect, because over the next couple of months, Bobby's state of mind seemed to grow steadily worse. At first, the decline was barely noticeable. He'd seem overly distracted or seem to forget simple tasks that he'd only just relearned. But soon his fellow miners started noticing a darker side. Sometimes during shifts, he'd slip away from the crew without saying anything to anyone, drifting off into the unworked entries or abandoned headings. On more than one occasion, a coworker found him wandering in the darkness without his cap lamp lit, feeling his way along the rib with his bare hands while whispering to the walls. When the coworker called out, he turned to face them, all glassy-eyed and slow, like they'd just woken him up from a deep sleep. Sometimes, instead of riding the man trip out with the rest of the crew to head home to his wife, Bobby would slip off into the derelict tunnels and work out of random areas, places that had been sealed off for years earlier, and he'd just sort of sleep there. One morning, a foreman found him curled up on a pile of old timber and rock dust in a forgotten crosscut, fast asleep as if he'd spent the entire night down there. No blankets, no food, just the cold and the dark for company. When shaken awake, Bobby seemed confused as to where he was and started to panic. But the foreman said that as his senses returned to him, he calmed to the point of silence and then just wandered back topside to get ready for his shift. A few months in, Bobby Ray's decline had the whole crew on edge, but no one expected it to end the way it did. No one. One afternoon in late 1973, John Joe Crow, who had been well aware of his old friend's strange turn, heard him muttering that he was going to get something before the next cut. It was common for miners to pull fresh oil or new bits between jobs, and they did so from the requisition tent that stood topside, but they tended to only do this towards the start or the end of a break. Bobby Ray, on the other hand, was right in the middle of doing something, and it didn't look like he needed new oil or new bits. John Joe didn't go chasing him down, not at first anyway. He just let his concerns stew till it forced him to check Bobby's rig, and that's how he found out that Bobby was in need of no replacement equipment at all. People had been letting Bobby Ray do just about whatever the heck he liked for weeks on end, but that time, John Joe Crow said that he felt this bad feeling in the pit of his stomach and decided to go after him. Maybe 5 or 10 minutes had passed in the meantime, long enough that John Joe half expected to catch Bobby on the way back to his rig. But all the way to the surface, Bobby Ray was nowhere to be seen. Bobby wasn't in the requisition tent either, and the equipment foreman also appeared absent. But as John Joe looked around, he found the foreman lying behind his counter, unconscious, and having a bloody head wound. Finding the foreman like that was bad enough, but upon looking around, John Joe's blood ran cold, because not only was the foreman's revolver missing, but several containers of highly explosive ANFO had also been taken, and John Joe flew into a panic. He knew that it was Bobby Ray that attacked the foreman, and he knew that it was down to him to stop Bobby from hurting anyone, and so off he ran, wild as a March hare, to find Bobby and stop what was about to happen. I was told he briefly considered just yelling out Bobby's name and letting everyone know they were in danger, but he also figured that if he did, Bobby might just start shooting people. Bobby needed to think everything was just peachy, so when John Joe caught up with him, it'd be him throwing the ambush and not the other way around. John Joe ran all the way up to the Old Man Trip Road, just out of sight of the portal, and there was Bobby, strolling towards the entrance of mine number 44 like he didn't have a care in the world. John Joe caught up with him quick, and as he did, he spotted the pistol grip poking from the back of Bobby Ray's waistband, as well as something bulky strapped tight around his waist under the denim. Not wanting to alarm him, John Joe slowed to a fast walk, and then when he got within arm's length, he yanked the pistol out from Bobby's waistband before he could react. Bobby Ray turned, looking back at the old friend the way a man might look at a stranger, with this calm and distant look on his face. And that's when John Joe worked out what all that bulk was under Bobby's shirt. Strapped to his bare skin using mining tape and wire, Bobby had strapped the stolen containers of ANFO. They turned out to have been crudely rigged, but they were set to blow all right, and by the looks of things, there was enough to bring down the main entries and bury every soul still underground at the time of the explosion. According to the tale I was told, John Joe Crow looked his old friend in the eye and told him, "This ain't like you, Bobby." But the man standing in front of him wasn't Bobby Ray anymore. Whether it be the gases, all that time in the dark, or the blow to the head, it had hollowed him out, and now something else was steering him. Folks say John Joe saw a grim and steely determination in those glassy eyes, and from the way Bobby Ray's hand twitched towards the detonator cord, John Joe knew that there was no talking him down. He just couldn't bring himself to point the pistol and fire until his old pal lunged for him, and when he did, Bobby was dead before he hit the ground. John Joe never went underground again after that. He hung up his proverbial pick and shovel, proverbial because they obviously weren't using either by that period, and retired from the industry for good. There was a full investigation into what happened, and I was told sheriff's deputies were crawling all over mine number 44 for weeks. But since Bobby Ray's body was found with all that explosive strapped to it, it was pretty much an open and shut case, whereby John Joe was cleared of all wrongdoing. But it went further than that, too. Every miner who was on shift that day knew John Joe Crow saved their lives, and they never stopped thanking him for it either. But old John Joe, on the other hand, who never got paid for another drink in a miner's bar for as long as he lived, never liked hearing the thank yous, because to him, they were thanking him for shooting one of his best friends, while John Joe spent the rest of his days wondering if things couldn't have been different. Back in the summer of 2015, my friend and I went camping in the 100-mile wilderness up in Maine. Everyone kind of associates the Appalachian Trail with places like Tennessee and North Carolina. And yes, I get it, those places are like spiritually Appalachia, with their coal mines and snake handlers and fellers wearing dungarees playing banjos, all that stuff. But the trail actually starts way up north, and some of the wilder sections are actually up there and not down south. So that's where me and my buddy headed that year, driving up from Boston to get away from it all for a couple of days. We set up our tents near this little clearing by the stream, then the next morning I woke up early and stepped out for a smoke. It was still nice and cool out and quiet too, so after lighting up I just stood there, half awake and soaking it all in. But then I think I was only maybe 4 or 5 drags in when I heard something rustling behind me, real soft. I turned around slowly, stupidly slowly actually, considering what was about to happen. But when I looked, there was this guy sneaking up on me from maybe 10 feet away. But it wasn't just what he was doing which put me on edge. He looked messed up, and that's putting it lightly. I don't want to say that he looked inbred because, to be honest, I don't even really know what inbreds look like. But I wouldn't be surprised, because his face just looked wrong. His face seemed to be deformed with skin that looked pale and stretched. His forehead had a weird slope to it. He walked with a hunch, and his eyes not only had this unnatural darkness to them, but they were way too close together. His clothes looked new-ish, or at least he wasn't in rags, so someone was taking care of him in some capacity. But in his hand, and this is what scared me the most for reasons that'll become very obvious, was a hatchet. And it looked ancient, with a blade that was pitted and dull. But a hatchet is still a hatchet, you know what I mean? And at first I was sure that he was going to rush me, swing at me. And so I got this adrenaline dump thinking, this is it. Some backwoods psycho is about to chop me up right here by my own tent. But he didn't charge. He just kind of shuffled closer, holding the hatchet out like he wanted me to look at it. I didn't move. I just stared at him, trying not to freak out visibly as his face lit up into this weird sort of childlike way. Like all excited and innocent, but also creepy as hell because this guy looked like 40 at the very youngest. He was grinning this lopsided grin, holding it firmly but gently like it was his favorite toy, and all I could think to do was start talking to him very calm and low, saying, "Hey buddy, nice hatchet you got there. Where'd you get it?" I know, dumb thing to say. It was way more about my tone of voice and making clear that I was no threat to him at all. I kept my voice steady, I kept my hands where he could see them, and made no sudden movements. And you know what? It kinda worked. With that same lopsided smile on his face, he started pointing at the hatchet and then at me like we were hatchet bros or something. And while I was extremely relieved that he wasn't hostile, it was eerie as hell. I guess he had the mind of a little kid, so I said just about anything that popped into my head that I thought might keep things chill. Everything's going fine, and I'm slowly kind of backing away from the guy when suddenly my buddy pokes his head out of the tent. Now he's cranky, half asleep, and he's rubbing his eyes, and he starts asking in a loud voice who the hell I was talking to out here so early. His voice was grumpy, like he thought I was on the phone or something, but then the second he heard my buddy's angry voice, the deformed guy, his whole vibe changed instantly. His face twisted up, his eyes got wide and angry, and I remember seeing him grip the hatchet tighter as he took a step closer. I could see the switch flip, that childlike playfulness turning into something angry, almost feral, and seeing it made my stomach drop. The guy's eyes were glued to my friend, who in turn had this horrified look on his dumbstruck face waking up. So acting on pure instinct, I stepped between them while saying, "Nah, buddy, don't do it. Everything's just fine. You just startled us is all." I tried to keep my words simple and soothing, repeating that everything was fine and that he was safe and we weren't enemies. This guy hesitated, looking back and forth between us, all agitated, while my friend, the smart guy that he is, knew to shut the hell up and let me handle it. The tension was thick, real thick. The kind it feels like when you can cut it with a knife, and how all it's going to take is one wrong move and everything's going to hell in a handbasket. The guy muttered some garbled sounds, almost like he was trying to talk but couldn't get the words right. And then he swung the hatchet a little into the air, not directly at us, more like in frustration and fear at some invisible fly. And after that, he started to back up, looking at me and then my buddy, and back again. Now, I kept talking to him as softly and calmly as I could, saying no one was going to follow him, and that makes me like 70% sure that he really could understand me, because when I said the thing about not following him, he turned and bolted off into the trees. He was way faster than he looked too, another thing that freaked us out, like his parting gift was showing us just how screwed we would have been if he had decided to attack us. We stood there, watching as he disappeared into the greenery, and then listening until the sounds faded, and then we just stood there, looked at each other, like what the actual F just happened there. I felt like I was in a dream, but we packed up pretty quickly after that, skipping our breakfast and calling time on the whole trip. Talking about it later, my buddy said that he thought that I was losing it when he first came out, but seeing that guy up close, it scared the living crap out of him. We never did figure out where he came from, maybe some isolated family way back in the hills, but regardless, that morning stuck with us. We kind of laughed about it these days, mostly in a nervous way while calling him Hatchet Man, but yeah, that was one camping trip I'll never forget, and a reminder that while we like to think of this country as entirely civilized, there's still people out there who choose a wilder kind of living. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul, and all the links are down below in the description. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, every woman can be a Supergirl.